Hello everyone, welcome on into another stream. Hope you're doing well. Scaleezy, Astanex, Chadwick Dillon, Killer King, nice to see all of you again. Nice little make contact gesture there. Doing pretty well, how about you guys? Alright, so yesterday we watched a couple videos, one 2-minute video that took about an hour's worth of reactions with Zully the Witches talking about the 2 and 3 fingers potentially not actually being part of a greater hand, which was very fun. And then after that, we watched a video by Michaela about the gods and nightmares. And we followed that one up with half of Smoughtown's video about the great ones, just because apparently I take a long time, like a lot more time to react than I think I do. So today we'll be continuing from where we left off yesterday with Smoughtown's Bloodborne lore, the Great Ones. And then after that, I think we'll watch his next video with the Pthumerians and the Labyrinth. So a lot of Bloodborne lore on the docket for today. Hope you guys are all strapped in and ready to dive back on in.
Reborn.
Hey Mortis, nice to see you again. You fell asleep during Smoughtown's Pthumerian vid. I don't know if that's a compliment or an insult. Maybe a little bit of both.
But let me know your thoughts on the one reborn below. So we may as well continue with the other great ones found in the Nightmare of Menses, which of course includes the wet nurse Mergo and potentially Mergo himself. Let us start with the more straightforward of the two, Mergo's wet nurse, one of my favourite enemy designs of all time. My goodness, what a cool looking enemy. So yeah, of course we know that the wet nurse is a great one thanks to its achievement description, as if its alien form was not clue enough. Now its name and actions are interesting. The wet nurse of Mergo suggests that this great one has indeed taken to Mergo, and now looks after it and nurses it. And this is no surprise given what we have already discussed regarding the great ones and special children. The umbilical cord descriptions make it clear that every great one yearns for another child. And so the wet nurse clearly has claimed Mergo for its own, the inevitable instinct of a great one to seek a true child. A fact reinforced by the way it gently picks up Mergo and sequesters it, in an attempt to protect Mergo from us. And as a side note, there's a really interesting video by Lance McDonald in which he shows the previous versions of the opening cinematic to this fight that went through some dramatic changes. But one fact that remains true in all of them is that the wet nurse is concerned with protecting this child. But yeah, I do highly recommend you check out that video, and it will be linked below.
Yeah, one thing that I always took out, well, maybe not always, but after a while I kind of noticed in the Mergo's wet nurse cutscene is that after it cradles Mergo, it makes this kind of gurgling sound, which to me could have signified that the wet nurse was actually consuming Mergo. Maybe not in a sense of like trying to actually eat it and take its blood echoes or whatnot, but perhaps more in a sense to protect it with its body, which would be one hell of an image, wouldn't it? So there is one note that I wanted to make about Mergo's wet nurse, and I've kind of been meaning to make a video about this for like an extremely long time, but I just haven't gotten around to it for no real good reason. So I do think there is a strong potential that Mergo's wet nurse and obviously Queen Yharnam to a certain degree kind of act as reflections of each other, not in a literal sense, but in terms of like thematics. And Mergo's wet nurse itself could have potentially been inspired by the Ubume, which is like a specific Japanese yokai or ghost type thing, a mythological being that was known for being a woman who either lost her child or a womanly figure that would steal the children of others. And this is a little bit contentious just because, while it may have been some inspiration, there could be a degree of disambiguation between what's going on with Bloodborne and this kind of a folktale. And more specifically, if you go to like the Wikipedia page and look up the variations of the Ubume, there is a version of it in the Ibaraki prefecture that is the Ubame Tori. Wow, Ubame Tori. And it talks about. I'll just read this directly. In Ibaraki Prefecture, there are legends of a yokai called Ubame Tori, and when children go to dry their clothes at night, this Ubame Tori would think of the child as her own and give her some poisonous milk. This has some similarities to a similar wrathful spirit called a Kokakucho, and nowadays specialists infer that Ibaraki's Ubame Tori is the same as this Kokakucho. And furthermore, Kokakucho is theorized to be the changed form of a pregnant mother's spirit, so it is said that this mysterious bird is considered the same as Ubume. Also, the Ubume in Japanese legends is a bird that resembles the gull in appearance and voice, and it is said that it would land on the ground and shapeshift into a woman carrying a baby, and they would request, "Please hold on to this child," to the people that they met, and those that fled would be cursed with chills and fevers and eventually death. So this isn't like a super one-to-one thing, but I think the idea of the Ubume taking children from mothers and stealing them away is kind of similar. But I think maybe they altered a bit of the Wikipedia page on this, and I might just be misremembering, or maybe there's another source that I looked at that went into this in a little bit more detail. But the idea about giving it poisonous milk is that this creature is a wet nurse. So the Kokakucho will breastfeed the child with its own milk and cause it to become maybe like another one of these or something like, twisted. So perhaps that could have been what they were trying to impart upon us with Mergo's wet nurse being its wet nurse, that it was trying to feed Mergo and transform Mergo into its own image. Perhaps it's, really questionable, but if that is true, it would align with the whole idea of great ones searching for children and surrogates more specifically. So there are some other depictions that go along with this. I forget what the Shin Megami Tensei version of this is. Is it like Guoha? Something like that? I don't think it is. Oh, I shouldn't. So that's like the Chinese Guhuo Niao. Okay, yeah, definitely this thing. So, yeah, okay. So the Kokakucho myth came from China based off of this thing. And so it's a little bit curious, like how much got lost in translation between China and Japan, what folk stories different about these kind of creatures by region. So yeah, I just think it's really fun to bring up. And well, I don't necessarily know if this is truly the inspiration of Mergo's wet nurse. It does kind of seem to lend credence to the idea. So the Megaten site says that this is a monstrous bird in Chinese lore that kidnaps human children, mainly girls, and raises them as their own. Kidnapped girls will become a new Guhuo Niao. It is normally seen in bird form, but it is said to be able to take off its feathers and become a human woman. Okay, so this is probably what I was originally thinking of. A man who steals the feathers can make her his wife. And then it tells us about the Japanese version. Oh, and this one says the Japanese spirit, it came from a Japanese spirit of a woman who died delivering a child without providing care for her baby. So that's where I draw the parallel between Mergo's wet nurse and Queen Yharnam specifically, because Queen Yharnam has the kind of stillbirth imagery going on with her body there. So just to give a little bit of extra context, I think it kind of works out, but all individual interpretation. All right, so going back to chat, everybody else, welcome in. Do you think Mergo's wet nurse's arms and wings are glued on the invisible body, just like the head part with the cloth? I never really thought about how its actual body works, especially with its head being invisible, but its arms being visible. I don't know, that's a funny thought. Yeah, and Chadwick, oh yeah, I should have probably mentioned that You are correct that wet nurses aren't necessarily the mothers of the children. It's a woman who can continue to produce breast milk to feed a child, because not all women can produce enough milk for their children. And yeah, sounds correct to you, but you don't need that much convincing. Would Chadwick say as well? Oh, you disagree with Smo on a lot of his Great One thoughts? You have an open mind, though, so maybe you're just foggy on the position? Okay. The mother we do see with the baby ripped from her is Yharnam. Right. Mergo may have been born at the creation of Ram, and the wet nurse is there for the baby regardless. It depends on what you mean by the creation of Ram, but yeah, I haven't really thought of like connecting Ram and Mergo directly, although you could probably try to make that kind of argument with their sort of connection between the way Ram conceals Mergo's cries, but okay. Let's go back to the video now.
Yet we also know that Mergo is being used as a lure by the School of Menses to beckon the moon closer. As a lore note reads, "Nightmare's rituals crave a newborn, find one, and silence its harrowing cry." So there could be an argument to make that the wet nurse of Mergo is in cahoots with the School of Menses and are letting them use Mergo as a lure, but I don't really believe this. I am more of a mind that the wet nurse of Mergo simply isn't behaving in a way that we can comprehend. To my mind, it probably doesn't care or is even aware of the schemes of Menses, and it only has its instinct to protect Mergo. But please let me know your thoughts below. What do you think that the wet nurse of Mergo is doing here? Do you think it is working with the school? Or like me, do you think it only cares about defending Mergo, its charge?
It's kind of hard to say whether or not Mergo was the wet nurse's charge specifically, because that would imply that something has dominion over the wet nurse, which it might be the case, but we don't really know. I would tend to lean on the side of no, just because Yharnam seems a little bit helpless in the way she's facing the wet nurse, whereas if Mergo is Yharnam's child, and that is actually a big if, then why wouldn't the Pthumerian bride just say, hey, you can give the baby back to me now? So I think it might be possible that Mergo's wet nurse could have been an incidental summoning of Mergo's cries. Thanks, Killer King. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And, no, I guess I'll leave it now. So, yeah, if you guys do want to look at more of the Japanese and English translation stuff, I do have my spreadsheet linked in the video description. So, if you're ever curious about some of the differences between the text, it has my retranslations, the official English, as well as Aruki Mania's. So, we have some differences in perspectives where you can get even more information than just from mine alone. Yeah, the text waits until Mergo's cries stop, as well as the... what was I going to say? So, let me rephrase that. So, the Nightmare Slain text doesn't appear until Mergo stops crying, and it's extremely difficult to hear in-game because there's like a lot of wind and ambient effects, and if you step around that arena, you'll hear that there's like a bunch of bones crunching. So I missed this on my first, second, and maybe even like third playthrough of Bloodborne, that Mergo's cries don't just like fade away. They actually turn to snoring or like kind of restful, peaceful sleep. So actually, let's go ahead and pull up. I think he has... Okay, yeah. So this is Mug from the Bloodborne wiki. This is his YouTube page. So he has the direct audio of Mergo's cries uploaded to his YouTube page. So I'll play this here. Hopefully it's not going to be too loud. So that's the overworld. Alright, so this will be in Mergo's loft, and at the end, it becomes like a very kind of quiet snoring. I should have read that. Alright, so now that we've got all that crying in our minds, I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's really, really easy to miss. And there's a lot of issues with the sound production of Bloodborne. Like in 1.0, none of the sliders worked properly. I think it just like worked like master volume, so you couldn't adjust sound effects in relation to like in-game and background music. So it was really annoying. And with that being said, in the 1.0 version of Mergo's Wet Nurse's boss fight, the cries are a lot louder at the end and a lot easier to hear. And so they might have just made a mistake with the sound balancing once they like tried to go back and like patch all that stuff up. But I don't really know. All right. So what did Smo ask? Just our thoughts about Mergo's Wet Nurse? Oh yeah. So just to reiterate my point, I do think it's probably a coincidence that Mergo's Wet Nurse showed up, but you know, it's all very arguable as per usual in these analyses here.
Let's talk about the form of the Wet Nurse of Mergo, as it really is one of the most alien and fascinating looking Great Ones in the entire game, almost formless, with spider-like arms and crow wings. But as Sinclair Lore points out in a video on Mergo's Wet Nurse, the black robe and faceless visage is most likely a reference to Victorian era photographs, in which photos were taken of mothers and their children, except the mothers had their faces covered by veils or had their faces omitted entirely. This aesthetic choice is clearly meant to evoke the image of a mother, and shout out to Sinclair Lore for highlighting this detail. But in general, it is far...
You know, I never thought about that in relation to these statues, so that could definitely give more credence to the theory. And then this goes back to what I've said throughout many of my streams, that trying to tie one specific visual imagery or icon image into the game is a little bit like a Rorschach test, where people will just kind of see what they want to see. So it could be possible that my Kokakcho image is related to Mergo's Wet Nurse, as well as Sinclair's interpretation about like Victorian style mothers putting veils over themselves. And we could both be wrong. It's all fun and games. If you think this audio is bad, listen to the cut baby ocelot sounds. It's nightmare stuff. I'll refrain, but thank you.
Far less physical and alien compared to some of the other Great Ones, and gives off a more demonic or Grim Reaper vibe, which is certainly helped by the crow or raven wings, which are often used to symbolise death. And this demonic vibe is backed up by some of the naming conventions associated with the Wet Nurse. In the video by Lance McDonald, which I've already referenced, he points out that in earlier versions of the game, the Wet Nurse was only referred to as the Succubus, and the game data name for the Wet Nurse is Demon of Death and Darkness. And so earlier we talked about that gradient of the different types of Great Ones you can find, and there are some that are more grounded, or even at the very most are kind of like alien beings. But the Wet Nurse's form is really something else, something that is closer to a true nightmare, and you really would have no difficulty in believing that people worship this being as a god or demon. Its powers are very impressive as well, as the Wet Nurse has the impressive ability to manipulate the nightmare around it, creating a thick mist and clones of itself. And of course, the most important thing is that the Wet Nurse is barely physically there. We can't see most of its body beyond its spidery limbs. There is obviously some kind of head that is propping up the black hood that hangs over its head, but we can't even see it. And this lack of physicality is reinforced by the fact that when you hit the Wet Nurse, it doesn't even bleed. It just gives off a kind of smoke.
Yeah, and that was something that I was also going to bring up, and I figured he was just about to, so I stopped. To go along with the kind of mist that comes out of Mergo's Wet Nurse, I don't remember if it was Smoughtown's video earlier in the video where he talks about like the different colors of blood, or maybe that was his last one, or maybe it was Michaela's. It's kind of hard for me to keep things straight sometimes. That I do think with the nature of like kin type enemies having like the silvery blood being related to invertebrates is one thing. However, Mergo's wet nurse has this black mist that comes out of her, which to me indicates she's more of a spectral thing rather than a kind of physical being, which is a bit at odds with like the amygdala or even the moon presence, and kind of sort of the Orphan of Kos, with a bit of a caveat that we don't actually kill the Orphan of Kos by fighting the wizened child with the placenta. We kill the Orphan of Kos by striking down the wispy black mist, which is attached to the womb of Mother Kos. So if the true form of the orphan is this black mist, and by hitting Mergo's wet nurse we get this black mist, does that mean there's something intrinsic about the natures of the great ones that's contained within this black mist? Maybe. There's a strong possibility that this kind of black mist, I think, is part of the nightmare itself, and that's where we could get the idea of nightmare great ones. So when you defeat Mergo's wet nurse, when you defeat the Orphan of Kos, you get the text Nightmare Slain, and the Moon Presence does kind of stand alone between those two, but also in the fight with the Moon Presence, it has a lot of like arcane style attacks where it can transform the blood from being red into like this white mist as well as a black mist that can stop healing. So the Moon Presence might be like a more physical nightmare great one, if that makes sense. And just to tie this idea back into specters a bit more directly, when you fight the kinds of ghosts in Canehurst Castle as well as down below in the Chalice Dungeons, the Mad Ghosts, if you strike them, they make the same sound as hitting Mergo's wet nurse, and the mist pops out of them. But wait, there's more. If you also fight a Wandering Madness, or like a Wandering Nightmare as they're also called, they react the exact same way, where like the mist flies out of them, it's black, and if they're actually comprised of the nightmare, that's kind of where I get my idea that this kind of mist coming out of them is a nightmare mist, and the nightmare is just kind of like super condensed collective unconsciousness, perhaps. Yeah, Karasu is a crow. The wet nurse reminds you of an amygdala version of Eileen. And yeah, just to go back into that idea of like the weird physicality of Mergo's wet nurse, many people take Mergo itself to be formless because we don't see Mergo throughout the fight. But like I said earlier on, I do believe the wet nurse jumps down and cradles Mergo and sucks it into itself. So we don't actually know if Mergo is truly formless or if there's something else going on with the wet nurse. And I forgot to tie it back into Lance's video, which Smoughtown was talking about, but in that video it is a little bit clearer that the wet nurse like rushes past the player to take Mergo and absorb it into itself. So it is a little bit more ambiguous in the final build of the game, but I think you can still kind of get that reading if you know what you're looking for. Aren't Mergo's arms visible? They're kind of furry? No. Oh, you mean the wet nurse. Sorry. So yeah, and that's the other thing that I was going to bring up. Like, it might not have a face, but it does have some kind of form by virtue of like having these arms. So it's, I don't know what to say other than it looks cool. All right, so going back to the video now.
The wet nurse, it doesn't even bleed. It just gives off a kind of smoke. This of course makes me think of Erden the Formless One, leading me to conclude that both Erden and the wet nurse are a category of the Great Ones who are so in tune with the nightmare that they are barely physical at all, or not at all in the case of Erden. They are almost pure consciousness, even more highly ascended than other Great Ones. And
so I kind of agree and also kind of disagree. I think it's more likely that Erden is slightly different than the wet nurse in that it might not have much of a true form at all, and it might just be kind of a ghostly type consciousness that persists within blood itself. And I believe the reason that Odin is called formless is because technically fluid is formless, and so it can fit any container that it's put into. It's a very common. Actually, it might not even be Eastern thought. It might be. I'm pretty sure it is. So, like, how do I even go about Googling this? The form of water? I'm getting like super scientific answers. Tallies of Miletus. I don't know how to pronounce Greek things. So that's different. Maybe I just need to like type in Buddhism with it. Okay, yeah, I'm just not gonna look for it on stream just because I don't know like what terminology to go with it super well. So I might be wrong about this, just to be fair. So anyway, it's kind of like related to the idea of like Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do, and preceding Jeet Kune Do is like Miyamoto Musashi's ideology of formlessness being a form, and that's just kind of like tied back into Buddhism, where you have like truth in opposites, kind of. So the more you hold on to something, the more like it'll slip through your fingers. That kind of like paradoxical, oxymoronical thought in these kind of I don't want to say koans, but anyway, I'm struggling to find the words. So yeah, Odin might be formless, but I don't necessarily know if I would say that the wet nurse is formless to the same degree, is kind of what I'm getting at. If that wasn't made abundantly obvious by now. And Killer King brings up a good point that in Elden Ring, some of the forms, not forms, but the seals, the incantation seals are also formless. And you're saying Odin is a faith user confirmed. Hey, Murder Your Memory, welcome in. Been loving the streams. Keep up the good work. Bloodborne's amazing. Shame that hasn't gotten your PC, that it hasn't gotten any PC ports or updated visuals. Agreed. And welcome into the stream. If you burn the words of the gods into your mind, you remember the utterances and their powers, thus the rune tool. Kind of. So, yeah. Anyway, going back to the video again.
And once again, Loki puts this in a far better and far more scholarly way than I ever could, and so I quote them now. Like a Buddhist monk achieving nirvana, we see a correlation between the ego death and the ascension of humans to heavenly status. This detachment from what makes us human is why great ones will ultimately abandon their mortal bodies as spirits and assume alien forms. Not all are equal, of course. Some achieve unity with the universe better than the rest, becoming indistinguishable from the primordial ooze comprising all things. This hierarchy is part of the reason for Great One's variability. So
I don't necessarily know about like the tying the variability into that. I don't really, yeah, I would need to think about that more. But one thing that I forgot to bring up in relation to baby Mergo and its cries and the wet nurse's potential ties to Yharnam is that when I was bringing up how Mergo goes back to sleep, I think that's supposed to tie back into the Yharnam stone, where it says, the queen lies dead, but her horrific consciousness is only asleep and stirs in unsettling motions. The Japanese is slightly different. I mean, it's mostly the same, but there's kind of a difference where it says, rather than the part where it's talking about the queen's horrific consciousness stirs in unsettling motions, the Japanese is more like it's merely sleeping. So it's nothing more than like just asleep, I guess. Like it uses like 3 qualifiers to emphasize that it's sleeping. It's kind of a weird thing to try and translate directly because it's just a little bit overkill in English. So, all right.
once again, shout out for Loki for really getting these ideas down in a really concise and well illustrated way. As Loki says here, and as we discussed earlier, the Great Ones vary greatly. Some are very much still physical, yet it is ones like the Wet Nurse and Erden that have really transcended beyond humanity, and have become one with these higher planes of existence. And this is why the Wet Nurse is able to use powers that are essentially manipulation of the nightmare's reality. When it comes to Mergo itself, it could be a similar situation as to the Orphan of Kos, that the Mergo that is experienced here in the nightmare, given we don't actually see its form, might be just a manifestation of an aspect of Mergo's consciousness, that once again his physical body in the real world is no more, but here part of his consciousness remains in the care of Mergo's Wet Nurse.
And right, I would kind of agree with that, especially in relation to the Yharnam stone, which I was just showing off.
Obviously something of him here does remain, as it is his cries who are the source of the issues in the story of Bloodborne. And also we know from the umbilical cord that it was Mergo who the School of Menses were able to have an audience with. It isn't stated, but it is heavily implied, almost outright, that Mergo was the child of Queen Yharnam of the Pthumerians. A manifestation of Yharnam's grief can be found in the nightmare, drawn close to her lost child, and still bloody from the pregnancy, as if Mergo was ripped from her unceremoniously.
And if you do take that reading, it does become a bit more difficult to try to explain the actual Yharnam stone that you get from the queen down there in the chalices. I know many people like to believe that going into the chalice dungeons is going into the past. I don't necessarily buy into that theory, just because it's... I just don't like it. It doesn't pass the vibe check for me personally. So if Yharnam stone contains like the queen's consciousness, does that mean the Mergo is the baby in the Yharnam stone? Maybe. It's just really tough to tell. And then to tie into that, we did have pre-release content that was cut from the game, which kind of more directly connected Mergo perhaps to Cainhurst and Queen Annalise with the abandoned workshop umbilical... Oh, wait, I have a picture of it. The abandoned workshop's umbilical cord's description, which talks about... Hold on, guys. I'm struggling to stall for time. I should have typed in cord, not 1.0. Okay, here we go. Oh, yeah. So, one of the heirlooms used to contact the Great Ones, originating in the child of the Vile Bloods. Long ago, in an encounter with the Great Ones, a contract was established, establishing the Hunters and the Hunter's Dream. So, if some children were children of the Vile Bloods, could Mergo have been a child of the Child Bloods? I do think it's possible, and I have wondered whether or not in earlier iterations of the story that the raid of Cainhurst could have been so that the Healing Church could steal Annalise's child for their own kind of nefarious purposes, maybe to establish another kind of contract with the Great One, similarly to the way that Gehrman and the Moon Presence may have met. We don't really know. There's just a lot of conjecture that goes along with that, so just figured it'd be worth sharing. You would suggest that the stone is like the cord, something that ties Mergo to it as a part of his body. Perhaps. The Child Bloods, yeah. Okay, going back to the vid.
She is found outside the room with Mergo, weeping, and only relenting when Mergo's cries are silenced. At which point she gives us a respectful nod, again really implying that Mergo was Yharnam's blood child, a surrogate child via a blood marriage, a pact that is described by the betrothal ring item description, which reads, "The inhuman beings known as the Great Ones imbued this ring of betrothal with some special meaning. In the age of the Great Ones, wedlock was a blood contract, only permitted to those slated to bear a special child." So Mergo is clearly one of these special children, a blood pact between Yharnam and the Great Ones, and in this case I suspect it is of course the wet nurse of Mergo, who was the Great One who was on the other side of this pact. I do believe that Mergo's wet nurse has been in possession of Mergo for a long time, and that Mergo's loft and the attendants, which I believe to be Pthumerian, are a reflection of old Pthumeru, from where Mergo was taken by the wet nurse. Now, the reason I believe that these attendants, Mergo's attendants, found in Mergo's loft are Pthumerian is for two main reasons. A, because of their medieval weapons like swords and crossbows, and of course their plate armour and chainmail. It is more medieval-like, and therefore is similar to the type of arms and armour that we can find within the Labyrinth, within Pthumeru and Lauren, applying that these attendants are from an earlier time period. And given that Mergo is most likely the child of Queen Yharnam, we have to assume that these attendants are also Pthumerian, originally members of that society who served this special child, which will of course have held prominence in their society. And B, some people have been able to use Model Viewer and remove the armour from the chief attendants, revealing that they have the Pthumerian skin tone underneath. And I just want to give a quick shout out to Bloodborne Wiki. This is a really in-depth wiki run by community member Meph that just goes above and beyond most other wikis, and is the place where I found the internal game references for enemies, and where I found the image of the Mergo attendant without the armour. So please consider visiting the wiki and maybe giving Meph some support. And I'd like to give a shout out to a really good episode by Sinclair Lore, which they did on the Mergo's attendants, which was a really great resource for studying these guys, as there's not a lot on them. Indeed.
So yeah, I would definitely recommend the Bloodborne-wiki as well, because it is head and shoulders above pretty much any other wiki if you want to have really valuable and what's the word? Not insightful, but like truthful? Truthful like resources about Bloodborne, because it is all directly vetted and curated through Meph's kind of tireless work in cultivating that wiki. And that is pretty much the only game wiki of FromSoft games that I would recommend is okay to look at things for like lore information, because it doesn't really have like side comments where people put in their speculation that just kind of gets taken for granted, or just straight up outright false information, with the exception of like there might be some mechanics that just weren't completely fully understood. So there might be like a few discrepancies here and there, but overall a lot of the information on that wiki is extremely carefully vetted for its accuracy. So all right, setting that aside, I did want to give another possible reading of Mergo's wet nurse in relation to Mergo and Queen Yharnam specifically. Let me just back up here real quick. So, oh boy, this is something that I've been sitting on for a while, just because it's kind of one of those theories where, even though I've been an extremely big proponent of saying that the two Pthumerians corpses that have the Great One Cold Blood down in Pthumerian Isle shouldn't be considered Great Ones, I'm going to kind of shoot myself in the foot here and give you this kind of thought line, which may not be true, just, disclaimer, that Queen Yharnam herself might technically be a Great One by virtue of her consciousness being able to persist in sleep or dreams, not only in the Yharnam Stone, but also the fact that she's able to make these kind of manifestations in the Nightmare of Menses, as well as like next to Ram. So she's not exactly your run-of-the-mill human by any means, but does she actually count as a true Great One? It's arguable. We're not given any explicit confirmations about that. However, if we go back to the Ring of Betrothal even, that it talks about in the age of the Great Ones, wedlock was a blood contract only permitted to those slated to bear a special child. And that could make it sound like the Pthumerians shouldn't necessarily be considered Great Ones, which I think is kind of true, at least not all Pthumerians. But we do have a very curious description which has made me reconsider the actual biological status of the Pthumerians. So I'm not very happy about sharing this, but I think it might be context worth considering. So I think it's in the yellow bone. Where is it? So it'd be Bastard of Lauren, wouldn't it? What is it? Sage's hair, inflicted organ. Oh yeah, I should have just typed in Great One or something like that. Yeah, I'm just gonna type in Great One. So Pearl Slug and Living String. So what? Maybe it was one of these. Irregular beings. What am I trying to remember? Sorry. It's been a long time since I've looked at Bloodborne's text. Maybe it was stimulate. Some stimulated guardians can be seen. Oh no, that's mine. So the Watchers. Okay, yeah. So anyway, for some reason I thought, is this part of a mechanical thing where it combines? Sorry, I'm gonna have to go on a little bit of a lore hunt live. Sage's Rost. So what are these used for? Lower Tumeru, fetid. Okay, so these are used for fetid rites. So I think it's supposed to inspire the ire of the Great Ones. And was that just Bastard of Loran? No, because I looked up Great One. So anyway, the whole idea is that certain rituals stimulate the guardians of the tombs, but I thought it said Great One, so maybe I was actually just like misremembering or misinterpreting something. And not in like a translation sense, just like I had a messed up idea. So, okay, anyway, I'll just leave that alone, explain my idea, and then I'll like research it later and clarify. So, you're probably picking up what I'm putting down already, but with the ability to anger the Great Ones with certain cursed ritual rites that you do to get into these cursed chalices, cursed and defiled chalices, it could mean that the Great Ones are the denizens of those chalices specifically because they're the things that are actually like stimulated by the sacrilegious rites that you're conducting. But to be fair, not everything that we fight down there is like a Pthumerian, because it's like pigs and stuff will be extremely powerful, and it's not like an enemy per enemy thing. It's just kind of like a blanket thing. So anyway, could the Pthumerians have been considered Great Ones? Maybe not all of them, but definitely some of them with Queen Yharnam is something I would argue. I think it's also arguable that like the Pthumerian elders are probably adjacent to Great Ones because they can like shift between planes temporarily, or they can do like the quick step, kind of like Gehrman, but like way, way better. And Yharnam herself also has a lot of techniques in her fight which mirror the wet nurses by being able to summon like 3 clones of herself. The baby will be crying during her fight, like with Mergo's wet nurse. So just kind of some cursed knowledge to share with you guys, that Great Ones might also include things like Odin, but it might also be some of these Pthumerians. So sorry for going off on that. A little bit of an unfruitful tangent there. Was the line about Pthumerians being superhuman? Oh, maybe it's in chalices. Okay, yeah. Let's look that up real quick. Damn, I closed it. Why did I ever close it? I don't know why. I didn't think about that. Because that makes way more sense. Curses are caused by inciting the anger of the Great Ones and used to hex others. Special materials are required to complete the ritual. To try one's hand at curses, first seek the Bastard of Lauren. Okay. Thank you so much, Killer King. I can't believe I didn't think to look at the chalices. So, right. If you are actually inciting the anger of the Great Ones, and the things in these chalices are affected by that, does that mean they're Great Ones? Probably not, because, like I said before, it affects non-Pthumerian things like scorpions and pigs and all that stuff. But who knows, because these chalices take us to the kind of homes of the Pthumerians, perhaps. I don't know. Hey, Zelda here. Welcome into the stream. You drink to the chalice to commune with the Great Ones, so maybe if you throw some spicy ingredients in there, the Great Ones get pissed that you messed up the recipe? Yeah, kind of. It could be the Great Ones empower their servants. Yes, and that is another possible reading of this kind of description. So that's why I think it's important to hold skepticism for these kinds of ideas, and that's why it's important to not just take a lot of these descriptions at face value, in my opinion, because even when something is a little bit straightforward, there is that kind of a metatextual ambiguity that can be argued about. So let's fast forward a little bit.
To bear.
Oh yeah. So then he mentioned the wiki and then Sinclair's video. Okay, we should be good here.
Attendants, which was a really great resource for studying these guys, as there's not a lot on them. Indeed, I would speculate that Mergo's Loft, the building part of the Nightmare of Menses, is basically a Pthumerian reflection, and it seems to be fully under the control of Yharnam and Pthumerians, with there being shadows of Yharnam in the upper areas, and of course Mergo's attendants through the middle loft. So my suggestion is...
So yeah, I also meant to mention this in relation to Smoughtown's thoughts, that I think it's kind of fair to believe that these things are Pthumerians, even if we don't have explicit confirmation for pretty much all the reasons he cited. Also, internally, they're called like Mergo's attendants, so whether or not they're Pthumerians or like related to the Vile Bloods is arguable, but I think it's just more likely Pthumeru is what they're kind of going for in the final build of the game.
Is that in this nightmare where Mergo manifested, around him were also manifested a mirror of the world he once knew. Now, whether they are actually drawn into the nightmare physically, like the lecture theatre, or it's a mere reflection is up for debate. But in short, I suggest that part of Yharnam, her grief, has made her way into this nightmare seeking her child, with her shadows in tow. Also, Mergo was drawn in.
And yeah, that's another good reading that you could take from this, that these things might not have always been in the nightmare with the School of Menses, and they could have come with Queen Yharnam herself. But if that's the case, it is a little bit curious why she is non-hostile towards us, why she meets us down in the Moonside Lake, and why she kind of guides us to where we need to go.
With his attendants. And so we have some reflection of parts of Pthumerian society here. We of course know that the Pthumerians were well acquainted with the Great Ones. As the Pthumera Ehil Chalice reads, this reveals that while early Pthumerians were mere humble guardians of the slumbering Great Ones, their descendants felt entitled to name themselves a leader. In English, this seems to imply that the Pthumerians were literally guardians of Great Ones who were asleep, like they were physically guarding their bodies while they slept. However, I find the translation provided by Last Protagonist in their translation spreadsheet to be far more interesting and more in line with what we said in regards to the arcane in the earlier chapters. The translation reads as follows. Pthumera Ehil means Pthumerian monarch or royal capital. It may be proof that the Pthumeru civilization's descendants who deify the sleep of superior beings at least tried crowning a monarch. So rather than the Pthumerians acting as attendants to sleeping Great Ones, they deified or worshipped the dreams of the Great Ones. And this makes sense given all we have discussed in this video. The dreams or nightmares that are created and controlled by the Great Ones are essentially these other planes of existence. And referring back to the discussion we had with Loki and Last Protagonist translations of the arcane, many see the cosmos or these other realms as divine, as the purview of the gods, and thus the dreams of the Great Ones are essentially their heaven. So it makes sense that this is a
To be fair, I wouldn't go that far. I think it's kind of more like a purgatory, a place in between heaven and hell that does get probably shaped by its inhabitants by virtue of there being the two kinds of grand cathedrals and the hunter's nightmare. Why does my computer do this while I stream? So yeah, two versions of the grand cathedrals and the hunter's nightmare, two versions of Cathedral Ward, as well as a little bit of Central Yharnam with the Beastclaw Hunter, which I think is supposed to be analogous to Gilbert. Yeah, computer hates me while I stream. Feels bad, man. So, right. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I do think that you could make the argument that the nightmares are divine, but divine in the sense of Bloodborne is something that is simultaneously sacred yet profane. And this is one of the things that it just really fascinates me with kind of the buildup of From Software's in-game universes and their mythologies, in that the reason it's sacred and profane is because there's always a kind of certain holiness in that goes along with the spirit, and the profane aspect of it comes from trying to absorb that holiness, which is extraneous to the individual, and kind of cannibalizing the life of others. So there is divinity in the individual and the self, and stealing others' divinity and self is kind of a terrible taboo, which could lead to ruin, or maybe also ascension. And so this kind of goes back into one of the core themes of Bloodborne, more so than the other games. It's that, in my mind, the question that I always bring up is that if transcending humanity means you must leave your humanity behind, would you do it?
Civilization that worships the dreams of the Great Ones, worships their version of heaven. Now, something else that interests me in regards to Wet Nurse is the Shadows of Yharnam, as they do have a fairly similar appearance to Mergo's Wet Nurse. Now, like everyone else, I assume that the Shadows of Yharnam are essentially the guards or defenders of Yharnam herself, given their name. But that doesn't mean that the Wet Nurse's appearance doesn't have some bearing on why they are so similar in appearance. In Mergo's loft we find lots of bird cages and crow hybrids, and of course this makes us think of the crow-like wings of Mergo's Wet Nurse. So here is my conjecture, given all we've discussed about the Pthumerians building their society around these blood pacts and worshipping the dreams and nightmares of the Great Ones. Yharnam enters into a blood pact, as per tradition for Pthumerian queens, in order to produce a special child. The Wet Nurse, a Great One, is the other side of said pact, and thus Pthumerian society comes into contact with this godlike, demonic-looking being, and essentially begins to worship this Great One. A Great One they've managed to draw the attention of through this special child. And if we can assume that Mergo's loft is a nightmare reflection of an old Pthumerian palace, for example, the palace where Mergo once lived, then it does really imply that the Pthumerians adorned it with bird cages to honour the Wet Nurse, and perhaps the Shadows of Yharnam designed their appearance around their deity. This is of course wild conjecture and speculation, I must really stress that, because while we now see that Yharnam is obviously very upset about losing her child, you have to remember she comes from a society who venerate these beings, who venerate these planes of existence. And thus, having made contact with the Wet Nurse, it would make a lot of sense if they moulded a lot of their society around it, hanging bird cages with crows everywhere to reflect their crow-like deity, as well as taking on the cloak of this god for the royal protectors. But once again, let me know your thoughts in the comments below what you think about the connection between the Shadows of Yharnam, Queen Yharnam herself, and Mergo's Wet Nurse. This is how I see Mergo's loft in general, that it's a reflection of Old Pthumeru, where Mergo is originally from, and it's only later, making contact with Mergo, that the Nightmare of Menses would spawn fully and bring the School of Menses into this equation. And at this
So, just to kind of answer Smoughtown's question, I do think that, how do I say this? I understand exactly why he thinks the shadows of Yharnam should be connected to Mergo's wet nurse. And to be fair, I'm a little surprised he didn't mention it in the video that internally the shadows of Yharnam were called the Death and Shadow Brigade, and that kind of was a reference to Mergo's wet nurse, which was the lesser demon of death and darkness or something like that. And so, yeah, they were essentially her familiars in earlier builds of the game, but they seem to have been distanced from that idea just by the way that they were retooled to become Shadows of Yharnam and all that, rather than the Death and Darkness Brigade. So I do think he's right, at least visually, that they are connected, but I think the devs pivoted from that idea for whatever reason. And so I don't necessarily believe that Queen Yharnam would have had a pact with Mergo's wet nurse herself, or even the Shadows of Yharnam would have had a pact with the wet nurse herself. And part of my rationale comes from the way that, let me look it up for you guys, just to give you a bit of a visual reference here. The Shadows of Yharnam drop the Blood Rapture rune when they're defeated. And I don't know if I have a picture of Blood Rapture directly to look nice. Okay, well, anyway, besides them, the Bloody Crow of Cainhurst also drops Blood Rapture, which isn't too relevant, but I think it'll go to show that, Pthumeru and Cainhurst are kind of indirectly connected through this idea of the rapture in blood. Oh, yeah, and I should probably pull up my spreadsheets because I remember the difference now. Let's pull up this guy. Type in rap. All right, so this rune resonates with servants of the queen, carrier of the child of blood, who yearned for their queen's blood with little hope of requirement. For them, they find solace in blood rapture that serves as a surrogate for their desires. So I do think this final line right here about the servants of the queen having little hope of requirement is just flat out wrong, and a kind of a super unfortunate choice in terms of the localization here, and that the Japanese is a bit, I don't want to say more direct, but it is a little bit more ambiguous. Wait, maybe it's an artifact of a different time in the localization process. I don't know. So maybe the Japanese got updated and then this wasn't updated, but the Japanese for this, and I think Arukimania's would be the same as mine. Yeah, okay. So I'll read both mine and his just to get across the idea that it's not just a me thing. So that the Blood Rapture rune is communicated to those who serve the queen who holds a child of blood. To those who yearn for the queen's blood, they find their reward in Blood Rapture. So they do get a reward, and we're not exactly told what it is. At least not in this. And Aruki says that this secret letter also connects with those who serve the queen who bears the child of blood. Those who long for the queen's blood find compensation in the joy of blood, aka Blood Rapture. So, what is this form of compensation that these creatures are receiving? My answer is that when we give Queen Annalise blood dregs, she rewards us by giving us a sip of her blood. So I think the role of the Shadows of Yharnam is analogous to the Vile Blood Hunters of Cainhurst, who would go and hunt hunters to gain more blood dregs to offer to their Queen of Blood. And this Queen of Blood is both a reference to Queen Yharnam and Queen Annalise, because the queenly flesh, at least still in English, says that Annalise is the Blood Queen, although almost everything relating to Annalise was rewritten as Vile Blood in English, whereas the Japanese is just more like the impure blood clan, and impure being Kegare for all of you who are in the know. And so the Vile Bloods are the Kegare blood clan, and Queen Annalise is the Kegare blood queen, and Queen Yharnam is just the Blood Queen. So they're both Blood Queens, and that's going to, I think, establish a connection with how they work. So Annalise, Blood Queen of Canehurst, and the Yharnam Pthumerian Queen Trophy says, defeat Yharnam, Blood Queen of the Old Labyrinth. So they're both Blood Queens. They both have servants who partake in blood rapture, and I believe that blood rapture comes from the rapturous feeling, the warmth that they get when they sip of their queen's rotted blood, which is kind of what Annalise tells us will happen. Without Horn says, you don't really see the wet nurse being Mergo's father. Oh no, he's not saying Mergo's father. It's more like Mergo's wet nurse would have had a contract with Queen Yharnam to serve the baby and like the queen perhaps. Does the wet nurse's Japanese name leave the possibility that they're more directly related? No, it's about the same in English. That it's just like wet nurse. Yeah, they don't name what Great One Queen Yharnam may have shacked up with. I think the most likely answer would be Odin. But that's a good question. Okay, so I think that was all I wanted to say, hopefully. And if not, oh well.
This stage they start using Mergo and his loft for their own aims. Mikolash is said to be the host of this nightmare, and so I can only assume that he's managed to bridge the gap between the waking world and Mergo, and he is now playing host to this audience that they've gained with this part of Mergo's existing consciousness. But with that said, there is a little bit about the wet nurse's physiology that I still want to highlight, and that is the arachnid-like arms that we discussed earlier in this
Oh no, I see the obsidian crust, guys. We found the Glomide Queen.
chapter. And this brings us on to the next chapter, where in general we will discuss the arachnid forms of the wet nurse, the amygdala, and the nightmare apostles to try and understand what the relevance of this thematic choice is. The Nightmare Apostles have always fascinated me, especially since they aren't ever found in the waking world. They're primarily found in the Nightmare of Menses or in the Chalice dungeons, and Patches seems to be able to freely traverse between different layers of the nightmare, from the lecture theatre to the nightmare frontier, and given all that we have discussed already about navigating the dream and nightmare, this is no mean feat. While the Nightmare Apostles themselves clearly are not great ones, the very fact that the wet nurse itself seems to have some spider features does suggest there is some relation between these apostles, the great ones, insight, and the nightmare. Indeed, it appears that their connection to the wet nurse is reinforced by the game data names, in which they are referred to as devotees of death and darkness, and as you'll remember, the wet nurse is referred to as demon of death and darkness. I think that in general the name apostle suggests that these spiders are attendants and worshippers of the Great Ones. It's just that the ones in the Nightmare of Menses are specifically tied to wet nurse, whereas others could serve different Great Ones, much like Patches worships the amygdala of the Nightmare Frontier.
And just to be clear, because the visual imagery was a little bit misleading, perhaps, not like intentionally so, I don't think by any means, that he's talking about the ones that have the heads of people on them, and I don't believe he's talking about the headless spiders here specifically. The Nightmare Apostles are the spiders with human heads.
In Sinclair Lore's podcast on these Nightmare Apostles, they make the suggestion that these apostles found in the Nightmare of Menses were once Menses scholars. Another interesting concept brought up by Sinclair Lore is the original basis for the design of these characters. Miyazaki has acknowledged that he read the fighting fantasy books in his youth, and in these books there is an enemy type known as Spider-Men, and as you can see from the image that I'm showing now from these fighting fantasy books, it's pretty irrefutable that this must have been the inspiration for these spiders. The most interesting aspect of this is the origin of these Spider-Men from the fighting fantasy books. They were demon worshippers whose form was bestowed upon them by said demon. Given the demonic association of the wet nurse, with its original name and internal name, we could infer that there is a similar relationship between these nightmare apostles and the wet nurse. These are apostles, worshippers, and so perhaps they were once human scholars who worshipped the nightmare and then were granted this form by Mergo's wet nurse, so they may serve more effectively in the nightmare itself. And yet again, a shout out to Sinclair Lore for doing an interesting podcast on these unusual enemies, which again will be linked below. Some of these nightmare apostles still have human heads, like Patches and some of the others with their lovely bowl cuts. This again implies that they were once very much human. At this stage, it should be very much clear that it's quite common in the world of Bloodborne for humans to transform. In the Future Press interview that we cited earlier, Miyazaki makes a comment about Patch's appearance, and he says the following.
Alright, so just to give another thought that can go along with this is that I don't necessarily know or agree with the idea that they transformed from worshipping their gods. And one reason I say that is because of the existence of Krogs and Does in the Nightmare of Menses. So for those who may not know, a Krog is a dog with a crow for a head, and a Doe is a dog with a crow for a body. So, yeah. I do think that the School of Menses may have been experimenting with head transplants in general, and they may have wanted to become, like, attached to the giant spiders for who knows what reason why. Maybe it's because there are headless spiders down in the chalices, and they're like, hey, these things don't have a head, but they still exist. What would happen if we put our heads on their body? I don't necessarily think that's the rationale there. It's just, one potential reading there. And for what it's worth, I don't think these things are actually spiders because they have 10 legs, but that's not really too important. You had no idea there were more than the patches with the heads. So yeah, if you try to go and lower down the brain of Menses, there's going to be one room that has 5 or 6 of the little spiderlings. And then also when you drop down to fight the Winter Lanterns, there's going to be some more spiders down there, I think. I don't remember if those ones have the heads or not. Chadwick says, one is an apostle of a single figure, a follower of high rank. Mergo has nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with those spiders in your mind. It's just a misunderstanding. I don't want to say it's a misunderstanding because I don't think they're really trying to say, oh, this is definitely what it is, as much as just present an idea of what they could be, which I respect. So, and this kind of goes back into some of my criticisms against other content creators, where when they do make it very clear what is based off of opinion or speculation, I can respect that angle, and I don't really I don't try to be as harsh to them because it's very clear they're not trying to have an authoritative tone that can be misconstrued or mislead audience members into believing something that is just kind of really contentious, perhaps.
There are a lot of other Spider-Men in the game apart from Patches, but all the others have long since gone insane. Patches, despite being exposed to enough of the world's mysteries to be transformed into a monster, has still retained his sanity.
So I wonder if mysteries here comes from Shinpi, which is aka the Arcane, which is my soapbox platform launcher right there.
And is continuing with his research. So firstly, this does confirm that they were once human, but they have now gone insane. And secondly, Miyazaki says that Patches has been exposed to enough of the world's mysteries to transform, more or less confirming that these nightmare apostles are humans who have been exposed to the eldritch truth, to the arcane of this world, have had their minds enlightened by insight, and have ascended to a new form, just not the form of a great one, obviously. But perhaps the amygdalas and the wet nurse once took on a similar form when they were lesser, before they ascended to the level of a great one. Now, speaking of the amygdalas, there isn't a huge amount of lore on them, aside from they are confirmed to be Great Ones via the related achievement, and the amygdalan arm, which directly names them as Great Ones. It is interesting that there are so many of these amygdalas, and perhaps Patches' research and interest in them is due to the fact he's realised that he too could ascend to their form, as if there is some set way or path to ascend to this type that obviously multiple other people have undertaken. And in general, the amygdalas stand far apart from the category of mollusk-like Great Ones like Yharnam and Cause. As pointed out in a podcast by Sinclair Lore, the one I've mentioned on the Nightmare Apostles, there is a precedent for a human transforming into a spider-like Great One, Rom the Vacuous Spider. We hear about Rom's ascension to a Great One via Mikolash, who says the following:
As you once did for the vacuous Rom, grant us eyes, grant us eyes, plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy.
And so, as is par for the course at this stage in the video, it seems as though Rom was someone who was ascended to the level of Great One, thanks to insight, through contact with Cause, who proceeded to line her brain with eyes. Now, I know there is some debate over Rom's status as a Great One, with some suggesting she is more like a lesser kin, mainly due to the fact that Rom drops the kin cold blood item, rather than the Great One's cold blood. Again, to me, I think people are maybe perhaps a little too strict in the categorization of Great Ones, because remember, Great Ones are just a level of insight and mind that allow them to operate on a higher plane, and the variety within that pretty loose category is massive. Rom is not like Yharnam, is not like the Wet Nurse, is not like the Moon Presence. I see the Great Ones really as a spectrum of physicality and ascension, with those like Wet Nurse and Elden being so highly evolved they are barely physical at all, and stand in vast contrast to the crude and bloody brain of Menses. My point being is I still don't believe we really have any reason to doubt the achievements which name her as a Great One, and I think there is a danger in reading into this cold blood drop too much. As last Protagonist says in his Bloodborne's True Story, we don't accuse the human corpses that drop Great One's blood or kin cold blood of being a Great One, as you can find Great One's cold blood on random human corpses in the Chalice dungeons. And to quote last Protagonist from that video now, cold blood doesn't define what kind of organism it comes from, it just shows how many blood echoes are within its blood. Aside from this, Rom does have some very impressive powers, and in fact plays one of the most critical roles in the story. We of course learn of this via a note found in Elden Chapel, which reads,
Alright, before he keeps going and I keep getting distracted and forget my thoughts, I did want to say something about the idea of people transforming into spiders, but now I'm kind of forgetting it. Damn it. I let him go on too long. So, what did he say? Rom transformed. It had to do with patches, I think. Oh, yeah. So, with patches transforming kind of into a spider, I do think it's important that the section of Yharnam, which is controlled by the School of Menses, Yahar'gul, is completely filled with statues of amygdalae, so they may have believed that they could become amygdalae themselves, so that could potentially lead into some support for Smoughtown's claims of saying that Patches' spider-like form could be a product of worship into the amygdalae, although I would say there might be a caveat in that it might not be like literal worship as much as like the kind of pseudo-scientific method of research that went along with the kind of scholars in the healing church at the time. So their mistaken beliefs, which is akin to worship, was just kind of like pseudo-scientifically based. So they may have come up with some experiments which kind of damned them into these grisly fates. And then that also, I think, ties into the idea of the brain of Menses having an amygdalae style mesh in its head in its skull, and also the possibility of the way that Mergo could have inflicted them with malformed eyes, similarly to the way that Abritus inflicted, or not Abritus, sorry, well, Abritus slash Kos may have inflicted imperfect malformed eyes into Rom as well, and transformed Rom into a great one. And just to go and strengthen Smoughtown's point here, even though he used my quote there, I do think it's important to point out that the Brain of Menses is also kind of a great one, but it's also a little bit pathetic as soon as it stops shooting the frenzy bolts at people. So maybe some people are more accepting of the Brain of Menses being a bona fide great one because of its ridiculous arcane powers in comparison to Ram, but yeah, maybe it's also just a really big badass because it took one hell of a fall and is still kind of alive somewhat. I don't know. And Beans and Rice says, the Garden of Eyes implies some kind of link between spiders and the amygdalae with the spider medallion that they hold. So I have wondered whether or not the Gardens of Eyes were meant to be precursors to amygdalae, and that might have been more fleshed out in earlier parts of the development, and they just kind of pivoted away to have them be more separate, disparate beings, but I don't know. Spiders tend to be nightmare animals in general, creatures of the nightmare. And apostles to the nightmare may become the same. That's an interesting idea. Patches coming to see the nightmare may also make him a creature of it as well. And so, the blood imbibes him, perhaps. Yeah. Okay. Good comments there.
The Bergenworth spider hides all manner of rituals, and keeps our lost master from us. A terrible shame. It makes my head shudder uncontrollably, as well as a note found in Bergenworth itself that reads, the spider hides all manner of rituals, certain to reveal nothing, for true enlightenment need not be shared. It is only after we kill Rom the vacuous spider and return to Yarhar that we see the true state of things and confront the School of Menses, when the pale blood sky is truly revealed to us. In the same Future Press interview I've referenced a couple of times now, Miyazaki would say the following when asked the meaning of pale blood, and I quote, I think there are two different ways you could interpret pale blood here. One is the colour of the sky after you defeat the vacuous spider and the Menses secret ritual is revealed. The sky there is a very pale blue, like a body drained of blood. I think there's also a message placed in Yarhar Unseen Village that calls back to that. This is before the ritual is revealed, so when you are kidnapped and go to Yarhar you don't know what it could mean yet. Then after the ritual you look again at the sky and it'll dawn on you. So the pale blood sky is the true sky, and the vacuous spider has been hiding this reality from you. You may occasionally hear the cries of Mergo through this veil when your insight is high enough. A hint of reality. This is an incredible power. Rom is literally able to manipulate our perception and hide the ritual behind a pocket dimension or dream, and present us with a fake dream version of Yarhar. We can't see the cramped caskets, the people fused to the wall, any of that, until the ritual is fully revealed, and Rom's trickery is shut down.
And so this is one of the more annoying parts about Bloodborne that I wish the game had a little bit more development time to fully flesh out, in that we have the depictions of the pale blood sky in Yarhar and Central Yharnam and Cathedral Ward, obviously, but when you go back down to Old Yharnam, it doesn't exist anymore. So is the red moon even real? Is the night real? Was the sunset that we saw at the beginning of the game real? That's kind of what I was saying yesterday at the beginning of his video, that it's very arguable.
So this is quite the power. The manipulation of dreams and reality is really what we know to be in line of the Great Ones, the most powerful of which seem to be able to navigate, manipulate and create these higher planes with ease, like the Wet Nurse, Amygdala, and now Rom. But why? Why is Rom doing this? Well, I put forward a suggestion in my choir video, in which I took the fact that there's a choir member seemingly defending Rom's boss fight, and the fact a Menses scholar is a summonable hunter for the fight against Rom as evidence that the choir actually wanted Rom alive, as if it was stopping the Menses ritual. However, I have reconsidered this position and I think I might be wrong. In last Protagonist's True Story of Bloodborne video,
Damn it, I should have paused it before he mentioned me. No, I think that's kind of incredible to just be able to take that kind of criticism on the chin and rethink your opinions. So, mad kudos to Smoughtown for that.
they highlight the message that one gets when you come back to Yharnam after defeating Rom. In English, the note reads the following: Ritual secret broken, seek the nightmare newborn. So it doesn't really tell you what this secret was and why it's now broken. However, Last Protagonist provides another translation of this, which does make a better job at making it clear as to what you've just done when you kill Rom. And I'll read their translation now. The concealment of the ritual has been broken. Find the nightmare infant. This translation specifically uses the term concealment, along with the quote from Miyazaki. To me, it makes it clear that she's actually just hiding this ritual from us, but not stopping it, like I thought before. And so, if anything, Rom is unintentionally helping Menses, and helping bring about the calamity that is happening in Yharnam because the moon is being beckoned so low by the school of Menses. However, I don't believe she is doing this on purpose. Her name is vacuous, meaning empty, and in Scotland, if you are being less than kind about someone's intelligence, you may well refer to them as a vacuous person. Indeed, this does seem to be the intention in the Japanese as well. Loki informed me that the kanji used is hakuchi, which could well be translated as half-wit or idiot. So I feel that Rom is just doing this as a natural instinct without really understanding the consequences of her actions. Again, as I've said so many times, we don't really know what the Great One's thought processes are, or how they perceive the world. So I just think this idiot spider has either been tricked into helping Menses, or is just doing it instinctively. But again,
yeah, that's kind of my take on things as well, that it seems to be more incidental or coincidental than intentional, because Rom's intentions are very unclear, just like all the other Great Ones, really.
this is just my interpretation at the moment. Let me know your thoughts below. But
I like the at the moment there.
either way, we do need to kill Rom, so that this water bulwark that we talked about earlier, that is hiding the true ritual of Menses, can be destroyed, and we can confront the school of Menses and put an end to their schemes. But what is the thematic resonance of these spiders? Why are so many beings associated with the nightmare have a spider-like form? Rom, the Acolytes, Amygdala and Wet Nurse. These all have spider-like features, and also appear to be some of the most capable beings at manipulating and navigating the nightmare. I've always accepted this thematic reasoning without really ever knowing why. To me it just makes sense why spiders sit in a dream. But I just haven't been able to verbalise why I feel this way. But I will attempt to do so now, and I'll quote a Wikipedia article on cultural depictions of spiders.
I wonder if you could make the comparison to the way that they weave webs as to being something like a dream weaver, which I do know is popular, at least in some Native American tribes. But yeah, I don't really know about. Well, there is. Never. I'll just be quiet for now.
Which reads the following: Spiders are associated with creation myths because they seem to weave their own artistic worlds. Philosophers often use the spider's web as a metaphor or analogy, and today terms such as the internet or World Wide Web evoke the interconnectivity of a spider web. Ignore the reference to the internet and focus on the ideas of spiders weaving their own worlds and the interconnectivity of spider webs. To me, spiders are always a relevant choice for kin and great ones because A, the imagery of a spider's web and the interconnectivity of its strands is a good metaphor for different dimensions that are all interconnected. It also makes sense of their ability to traverse the different layers of dreams and reality, like a spider traversing different strands to move from one point of the web to the other. And B, the weaving of spiders being weavers that create something has always been evocative, to me, of weaving a reality into being, and I need not explain the relevance of this in a world which contains beings like Great Ones who manipulate and create their own planes of reality, especially when we consider beings like Rom, who literally weaves a concealment vision over the ritual of Menses, or the wet nurse of Mergo, who seems to be able to alter the fabric of the reality of the nightmare around her.
You know, even though Rom is called the vacuous spider, just kind of in my mind, I never really considered her a spider because of her appearance. It's quite definitively not spider-like, but at least for this game, I guess it's counted as a spider, and I should probably have considered that a bit more strongly in relation to like weaving a kind of a veil over the world, perhaps.
Finally, there is the totems known as dream catchers, a protective charm of Native American origins that is meant to evoke the image of a spider web. That is meant to be a protective charm that is hung over the beds of children to catch evil spirits or bad dreams. Again, in a world of dreams and nightmares, I shouldn't need to explain the relevance of this item, and if like me you've always associated weavers and spiders with dreams, but you haven't been able to verbalise why, I hope this does go some way to help explain why the thematic choice of a spider makes sense in a world that is all about dreams and interconnected realities.
So I think one other thing that we might be able to tie into the devs of Bloodborne's interest in Native American cultures or mythologies perhaps could be that something like the cleric beast might be related to the Wendigo, which was my very first Bloodborne Fear of the Old Lord video topic, in that the depiction of the cleric beast is almost like one-to-one to some depictions of the Wendigo. Like this one is really evocative. And also, do I actually have... I think I might have saved it on PC here. Damn it. What's it called? I actually don't know if I put it in the Art of Bloodborne channel. Let me double check some of my resources. Okay. So the mad ones of like the things that get summoned by the Witch of Hemwick, I was looking up some reference materials for Wendigo when I was making my video, and I think it was this time, or maybe I found it earlier. I don't really remember. I might have just been looking up Wendigo in general, not related to that video. I did come across this piece of art, which was a little bit striking if you're familiar with the Mad Ones of Bloodborne. So, like, initially I'm like, oh wow, this dude copied a Mad One, right? Wrong. This thing was published in 2013. When was Bloodborne released? I think it's 2016 or 2015. 2015, March 2015. So this predates it by more than 2 years. So I wonder if they like literally took this and kind of did a little bit of an academic dishonesty and just incorporated it into the game. It might just be a coincidence because, I mean, it's a black silhouette with things coming out of it, and there's just a ton of black silhouettes in art media in general. So if this is a Wendigo, you might be able to say that the Mad Ones are inspired off of Wendigo or the Cleric Beast. So, long story short, it might be possible that the devs were looking into Native American folklore for some inspiration, along with like things like the Catholic Church and the patron saint of hunting and all that. Lots of eyes and legs, plus round equals spider. Exactly. You become a Wendigo by being a cannibal, right? Sort of. It's a bit nuanced, but yes, in general, that is part of it. And yeah, Estella says the antlers aren't an actual Native American description of the Wendigo, which is true. However, I mean, if you look at like all of the Final Fantasy summons, they kind of don't. They're pretty well divorced from their stories of origin at this point. So sometimes it just kind of goes that way. In Hawaiian culture, singing and humming at night can attract evil spirits, which kind of reminds you of babies crying to attract great ones. Oh yeah, and that's another thing that's kind of like a little bit cross-cultural to an extent. And especially in places where like certain animals can sound like people if they're crying. So like one thing that just immediately comes to mind are like mountain lions. If you've ever heard a mountain lion and its cries, it almost sounds like a woman that's screaming. And if somebody has like the protective nature to go and try to rush to that screaming woman's aid, they could be met with a mountain lion. So there's certainly a lot of evolutional reason to be afraid of random noises that go bump in the night. Elk and deer also have human screams. I did not realize that. That's really cool. That can make a lot of sense with like the Wendigo connotations then being kind of related to elk and deer. Mountain lion screams are absolutely why people thought mountains were haunted. Totally makes sense. Coyotes too? I feel like coyotes are a bit more distinct, but you might be right. And of course, like a lot, I think it was theorized that puppies are way more vocal than wolves to try to prey on humans' inclination to like coddle babies, because wolves don't actually bark in the wild and stuff. So same thing with cats, I think, where like cats don't really talk to each other, but they will meow at people because they think we're like kittens or something like that. I don't know. Coyotes sound like people laughing and talking at a party. Interesting. Okay. And I guess that kind of goes in with like the laughing hyenas and like the Lion King. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, my point is like certain animals can prey on like the human psyche in kind of very unexpected ways. All right. But thanks for all the cool insights in the chat. I appreciate that.
I especially like the imagery of Rom being a spider who weaves a veil that covers up the Menses ritual. And so here we are, we've arrived at the most iconic of the Great Ones, the Moon Presence itself, master of the Hunter's Dream. More importantly, the Moon Presence is Pale Blood, what our hunter has been looking for since we first entered Yharnam. A note in the lecture theatre reads, "The nameless Moon Presence beckoned by Lawrence and his associates, Pale Blood." And this is confirmed by Miyazaki himself in the Future Press interview, thus making the Moon Presence the most important being in the game, which makes it all the more interesting that you can actually miss this being on your playthrough, depending on what choice you make. We can learn of the Hunter's Dream's origin via the third umbilical cord we find in the Waking World's Hunter Workshop, which reads, "The third umbilical cord precipitated the encounter with the Pale Moon, which beckoned the hunters and conceived the Hunter's Dream." So someone, presumably a hunter, probably Gurman, used this umbilical cord and in doing so made a connection with the Moon Presence, which created the Hunter's Dream, a carbon copy of the real Hunter's Workshop within Yharnam, as well as tying certain hunters to this dream and to the Moon Presence. But Gurman, one of the original hunters, was taken into this Hunter's Dream, and his doll...
So I would kind of disagree that the Moon Presence made the Hunter's Dream to a certain extent. I feel like it was probably more of a collaboration, but I guess one thing that I didn't consider, which is, going to be a real deep lore moment live on chat here, is that We don't actually have the Great Tree in the real version of Yharnam in the Waking World. So does that mean the Great Tree is more directly tied to the moon presence? Enjoy. It's the Elden Beast. The Lunar Beast.
Of the original hunters was taken into this hunter's dream, and his doll was taken with him. Everything was set up to the way it is now when we come here. A base with a helper and a doll to assist hunters that are summoned here. But why? The wording of the umbilical cord makes it clear that the moon presence deliberately beckons the hunters and created this dream, and it's clear to me that in the opening part of the game, when we take some blood ministration, we are bonded to the moon presence and the hunter's dream. Let's go through what happens in this opening cinematic. After we have some Yharnam blood ministered and sign a contract, we witness a sort of vision of a beast crawling out of blood and crawling towards us before bursting into flames. Then messengers surround us and we fall into unconsciousness before we hear the dull comment, presumably from the hunter's dream,
"Ah, you found yourself a hunter."
So my interpretation is this: the beast's approach is the approach of beasthood, which we stave off either by our inner resolve, insight, or by the moon presence direct intervention, because straight after this beast being burned, messengers appear, and then we hear the doll's voice from across time and space from the doll of the hunter's dream. The messengers that we see in game, to me, are essentially the servants or emissaries of the moon presence. It is they that we first see when a bridge is created between us and the hunter's dream. They are the ones who hold the lamps that lead us to the hunter's dream. It is they who guide us through notes, and it is them who actually arm us. We know that Gurman directly serves the moon presence, because if we kill him and are unable to resist the moon presence's power, we take his place. It is the moon presence that put Gurman in that chair. The moon presence is the master of both Gurman and the hunter's dream, and essentially us throughout the game. And so throughout the game we are directed by notes that are presented by the messengers, and we know what our aim is. When we defeat the wet nurse and silence Mergo's cries, Gurman then burns the workshop and is offering to send us on our way to let us wake up. And if we do choose that option, then the sun rises over Yharnam. So if Gurman serves the moon presence and he thinks our job is done after Mergo is essentially silenced, are we to interpret that that's what the moon presence wanted us for all this time? This has always been my instinct, and while we essentially serve as muscle for the moon presence to take out the wet nurse and silence Mergo, we can choose to go further and confront the moon presence. Our personal aim is to get Pale Blood. We have been asking everyone about it. Both the Blood Minister from the beginning and Gilbert both respond to a question about Pale Blood, so it is us that has come to Yharnam seeking Pale Blood.
Which obviously raises the question of how the hell did the good hunter know about Pale Blood before the night began? And obviously I think it's a little bit of a dissatisfying answer, but it's more or less just the MacGuffin that keeps us moving forward. So maybe Smoughtown has a more specific idea to tie into that.
So when we take the further steps of saying no to Gurman, fighting him, and then facing the moon presence, that is our decision. But up until that point, when the workshop has been burned and we've silenced Mergo's cries, that is what the moon presence wanted us to do. As I've said a couple of times throughout this video, the Great Ones don't necessarily think the same way we do. They have ascended minds that are far beyond the comprehension of ours. And so while the moon presence might not be thinking as a human with schemes, and they've brought us in to defeat Mergo's wet nurse and silence Mergo, perhaps just instinctively on a certain level, they know that something isn't right, and thus they summon the services of a hunter who acts as muscle. This would line up with some of the other notes found throughout Yharnam that hint towards the calamity that the ritual the School of Menses are doing could cause. One reads, "The Menses ritual must be stopped, lest we all become beasts. It is clear that the night of the hunt has happened before, as the citizens you speak to in Yharnam are familiar with the concept of a hunt as if it's just another day. So my assumption is the hunt is a regular part of Yharnam life, and going by the gothic horror tropes regarding werewolves, I would assume that the hunt happens on the night of a full moon, so once a lunar cycle. It's part of the culture of the city and explains why the church has a need for its own stable of hunters. Once a month the beasts rise, the citizens lock their door, and the hunters clean up the mess. A note does make it clear that it's when the moon descends that the line between beast and human is blurred, and so usually they just deal with it. As I pointed out in my choir video, it does seem as though the upper echelons of the church are aware of the moon presence, as they appear to have statue depictions of the creature around the orphanage. Likewise, the School of Menses, the other upper echelon of the church, is clearly aware of the moon presence as they are trying to beckon it. And of course there's the note that we referenced before that talks about Lawrence and his associates knowing about the moon.
Oh yeah, Without Horns asks, wait, he thinks Gehrman set the shop on fire? You guess if anyone did it, it makes sense that Gehrman did. So yeah, I thought about pausing it there because technically it's not explicit in the retail build of the game. However, there is cut content where the doll says that Gehrman burned the Hunter's Workshop. And even without that cut content, I feel like it's just kind of the most logical explanation as to why things are different. If Gehrman was chilling in the workshop, but then it's suddenly on fire and he's away from the workshop, I mean, it seems very likely that it was in his interest to get out of the workshop. Why? Well, one, because there's a fire, or two, because he knew about the fire and he's the one who set it. And the doll seems relatively unconcerned, so it just seems like something that he customarily does at the end of every hunt to signify to the good hunter that their dream is coming to an end and they should go back to the waking world. And there could be, I think, was it Okinawan or Ryukyuan, like burial practices where they would often set the houses of the deceased on fire so that way they didn't feel the need to linger in the physical world any longer as spirits than they needed to.
The point being that the relationship between the moon and Yharnam is an old one that has existed in some state of balance all these years. Yet we get the impression from numerous sources that this night in particular is worse, and that it's a long night, due to how low the moon is hanging.
The moon is close. It will be a long hunt tonight.
And finally, the threat of this night in particular is further reinforced by a note found within the hunter's dream itself. It reads, "To escape this dreadful hunter's dream, halt the source of the spreading scourge of beasts, lest this night carry on forever." Whether this note comes from Gehrman, the messengers, or the moon presence itself is largely irrelevant. Our role within the dream is to clearly bring about the end of this night, which is going on unnaturally long, thanks to the meddling of the School of Menses. This night is showing no end, and is plunging Yharnam into unmanageable calamity. My interpretation is either the moon presence itself, or Gehrman is the one leaving these notes, getting the messengers to pass them on to us to direct us, including the ones I just read. And we see they are often presented by messengers, which seems to reinforce this. If Gehrman is directing us, he is acting in the best interests of the moon presence, acting as a human-to-human emissary. However, my gut feeling is the moon presence is quite involved in this process. Perhaps when the moon descends once a month as part of its cycle, it innately knows how long the process lasts, and perhaps it does have a good reason for doing so, as there is a note that reads, "When the red moon hangs low, the line between man and beast is blurred, and when the great ones descend, a womb will be blessed with child." So perhaps the reason the moon presence descends once a month is so that it and other great ones have the chance to place a surrogate child within a suitable surrogate. So sort of a mating ritual for beings who can't mate in the traditional sense. Yet at the same time, it has hunters serving as its attendants, in case it needs some muscle to act on its behalf in the terrestrial realm. This is the purpose of the hunter's dream, and so perhaps it senses this disruption to its normal lunar cycle, It is being compelled to be drawn lower because of the meddling of Menses, and that is why we have been summoned. But I think the moon presence playing the role of a traditional moon and having a lunar cycle is very interesting, where we see the stars and moon. Perhaps the other celestial bodies are also great ones, existing in the cosmos above. The very fact the moon presence embodies the moon is exactly why it is the most confounding and inscrutable great one in the entire game. This is a concept that most humans are never meant to understand, and we ourselves are just a tool, and we are never meant to meet the moon presence. However, in a twist of fate, we can defy the moon presence itself. We came to Yharnam seeking pale blood, and should we not forget our mission and we pay attention to the certain hints, our hunter might realise the truth that pale blood is the moon, and by using the power found within 3 umbilical cords, we can slay Garmin, the servant of the moon presence, defy the psychic attack of the moon presence itself, and kill pale blood. With a rival defeated and our mind ascended, we too become a great one, the new master of the hunter's dream. Now, why the hunter knew about pale blood and why they were seeking it already is a discussion for another time. So thanks guys, that is my take on the transcendental great ones and their fascinating lore. What are your thoughts? Do you disagree with anything I've said, or do you have any alternate theories? I know there were some areas I could have talked about more, Ibratask and the moon presence, but this video was already getting quite long, and perhaps I will do a dedicated video on the moon presence itself down the road. But once again, I would like to offer my sincerest thanks to Loki, who not only offers me great insights and translations, but is generally there to bounce ideas off, and I am very grateful for that. And again, a shout out to Last Protagonist, whose work was also a great reference for me. But let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video and what you'd like me to cover next. But until next time guys, I will see you in the Hunter's Dream. Take care, and have a wonderful hunt.
Alright, that was a really good video. I enjoyed it. Obviously, I have my disagreements here and there, but let's go ahead and share it in chat, and then I will get into a little bit more of my take on the role of the moon presence and the Hunter's Dream, which differs slightly from Smoughtown's, in that I don't necessarily think that the moon presence has as much of an active role as some people believe, and I do wonder if the moon presence is meant to be analogous to something akin to the old one in Demon Souls, if you're familiar with that. So, for those who aren't, in Demon Souls, there's this big demon, which is kind of called the Beast in Japanese, and... Oh, no. Get down. Come on. No. 1 second. All right, I'm back. Getting attacked a little bit, yeah. So, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so I don't necessarily believe that the moon presence has as active in a role. Oh yeah, and I was talking about the old one. And so the old one is kind of just called like the Beast in Japanese, and its role was that it just kind of shows up in the universe of Demon Souls one day and just starts sucking the souls and like the life out of literally everything, and everyone's like, what the hell is this? It's sucking all of our life. We need to do something to stop it. And so they stopped it. And I feel like the old one in its kind of visual representation is a little bit similar to the moon presence. I don't want to say like spoiler alert, because the old one is shown in like the beginning of the trailer for Demon Souls. But I'm going to go ahead and show it just so you guys can get that kind of comparison. And this is the remake, so the original, it's kind of just like a nondescript blob with a tree-like structure and a big old mouth, And that's kind of like the moon presence, although the moon presence is a lot less flora-like, despite being named flora, and it seems more like a beast. And because the moon presence is associated with giving beasthood to others, and the old one is called the beast and causes people to transform into demons, I do think that there is a kind of parallel between them where they absorb the life and the vitality of others, and if other people take the life and vitality of others themselves, they kind of transform into monsters in their equivalent universes. So to me, the moon presence might just be a big literal parasite that's trying to siphon as many blood echoes as it can from as many sources as it can, and that might tie into the idea of why it's called pale blood, because as I've mentioned in yesterday's stream, pale blood comes from the idea of blood that has been drained, because the word pale means to be drained of color, and it's usually used to describe somebody's face when it gets drained of color to become a more lighter hue, a whiter hue. And it also ties into some of the visual imagery used in things like the pale tongues in Dark Souls 3, or I think the ears in Dark Souls 1, and all that stuff. So the moon presence could be draining blood, which is why it's called paled blood in Japanese. And so the sky of paled blood, or pale blood sky, is the sky that has been being drained and becoming a more purple color, according to Miyazaki's interview, which I never would have picked up on my own. So, right. Asenex would suggest that it wants to free Mergo, the creatures crying across worlds. If mere humans can hear it with enough insight, surely the moon presence knows. So, right. I do think that the moon presence is being beckoned to Mergo, but I don't necessarily know if it's meant to be attracted to Mergo in a benevolent way, or maybe Mergo is just a very resource-laden bait that could be used to grab a really big fish for the School of Menses. Or so they believe. But nonetheless, I do think there is a lot of room to argue that point in relation to the moon presence and the other great ones wanting surrogate children. But like I said yesterday, the whole idea of surrogate children is just kind of an interpretation beyond the literal text of the Japanese description in the umbilical cords. Not that I particularly disagree with it. And the moon presence's surrogate child could be considered Gehrman or even the hunter, because I think the note in Bergenworth, which talks about... it's going to be the biggest thing. Okay. Yeah, this one. When the red moon hangs low, the line between man and beast is blurred, and when the great ones descend, a womb will be blessed with child, is a little bit different in the Japanese, and I think it might have been changed. Let me look back at the Korean real quick. Oh yeah, this one's just as vague as the Japanese, so maybe not. Anyway, so there's so many different ways you could read this note in Japanese. I'll read mine and Arukimania's just because I'm pretty sure they differ. But anyway, when the red moon comes close, the boundaries of man becomes blurred. The revered superior being appears, and it shall embrace our infants. So that can be read so many different ways. I have up to 6 interpretations that I think are the possible, more natural readings of this. And so it could be saying that when the great ones appear, the great ones may embrace us infants. They can't embrace our infants, which it doesn't seem likely. It may embrace us infants. So, okay, let me rephrase this. So the great ones may embrace our infants, as in our children. The great one may embrace us as infants, or we may embrace an infant, or that we cannot embrace an infant. So obviously, I think the more natural reading is going to be that it embraces our infant, but the other bigger possible reading is to embrace us as infants, which could go along with the idea of how the Queen of Blood and like the Vile Blood Queen wish to cradle a child in their arms, this whole idea of embracing infants is brought up a lot more often in the Japanese text, and I think some texts got revised to be more along the lines of embracing infants. Oh yeah, so maybe that was the difference in the original, rather than like literally bearing them in the pregnancy sense. So I think let me double check the Korean again. Oh, okay, yeah. So I do think it was updated because it talks about the child being conceived rather than being held. Inte. So yeah. And Aruki Manias is when the red moon approaches, human boundaries become unclear. The great higher rank one appears and will surely embrace us children. And so he pretty much just says, yeah, okay. If you guys want to read that, it's on my spreadsheets. So I think originally they had been trying to go with the idea of conceiving and bearing special children, and then they pivoted away from that to holding them instead, which is kind of unintuitive, and you can make the argument that holding a special child could be a metaphor for bearing a child. I totally understand that. However, I do wonder, because of the second and third endings, when the moon presence does descend, it comes down and it tries to literally grab the hunter. So let's go ahead and see here. Okay, yeah, we gotta beat him. Right, so when the moon presence comes down... Oh, you know, it already got angry. Okay. So the moon presence comes down and it literally tries to embrace the hunter, perhaps to make the hunter its new surrogate child after we kill Gehrman. So the reason why I bring that up is if the moon presence does have a surrogate child in the form of the good hunter or Gehrman, does it necessarily need Mergo? I don't know, and it might be possible that it just wants a bunch of blood echoes, and the note in Yarhargul telling us to stop the Menses ritual could be trying to tell us to make the moon presence go away just because of its proximal effect on all the people of Yharnam, causing them to become transformed. So, Teen Sith said, you've heard tell that the moon presence's face looks like a cross-section of an umbilical cord? Yes, I would show that off on stream, but it's probably just better if I don't, just in case like some random images come along with that. But I will post it on the Discord, and I know like Father Dagdammit on the Discord does have like a really good picture of it to show off, as well as the potential of the moon presence kind of looking like an umbilical cord that's actually attached to its placenta with the kind of white mist that you can see in its concept art. Actually, let's go ahead and pull up that concept art. Okay. This will show it off a little bit. You can ignore the Yharnam stone, but so like the moon presence might be like the umbilical cord, and these kind of white mist, I think, things which I think are meant to be like blood echoes, could be it's kind of a metaphorical placenta. Wasn't there an item that said the Great Ones understood some human emotion still? I don't remember, but there might be. Ironic that I'm like, it might not be literally about pregnancy when Queen Yharnam was clearly pregnant. No, I'm not trying to say like there weren't Great Ones who had children with like women. I'm just saying that the moon presence and its connection to the hunter might be a little bit different. Although, I mean, we kind of like birth ourselves anew again in the third ending. So maybe it just wants Mergo to shut up. Maybe. It would be quite annoying. I figured you're being a little bit facetious, but I still try to answer those kind of questions seriously. All right, so I'm getting a little bit mauled right here, so I think I'm going to take a quick, maybe like 5 or 10 minute break to deal with the puppy. And yeah, he needs to go to the outside real bad. Okay. Yeah, so I'll be back shortly here, and I'm thinking we might pivot away from Smoughtown's next video, so that way I could keep it self-contained into one episode, because I kind of feel bad splitting them up this badly. So if you guys want me to watch the Smoughtown video next, and if you're okay with me either like cutting it off, let me know in chat, or if you want to watch something a little bit shorter, just go ahead and let me know while I'm AFK. Alright, be right back. And then this is the kind of noob trap setup killer. If we try to come this way, the boulder comes crashing through, and then you just fight a bunch of Cabra demons, a bunch of Taurus demons, and so having another recycled... Why is that back now? Well, you got by the oldest one in the book. Venom says, when you started this playthrough, you mentioned how obvious the ball rolling trap was, and I thought he's going to fall for it on a second trip through the asylum. I figured he probably didn't have a lot of hits with this byhander. Wait, what? That's actually really, really funny. Just straight up assassinated right there. Okay. Let's go get our damn souls back. So now we should have a little time to read chat. Nix what I said about the souls, guys. So if I remember correctly, you actually just need to walk off here. You don't run. Because that screwed me up for a while. Well, sometimes I just get stubborn. Which I really shouldn't do on stream. I tell myself not to do it on stream, and then I end up doing it anyway. Alright. Or then I say, let's play smarter, and then I continue to do the exact stupid thing that got me in the situation in the first place. There's our stairs over there. Damn it! I think I should survive the fall. Unless we get hit by, like, the skull again. I was wrong. Oh, that jerk. So much for preserving my humanity. Pinwheel's like the Volnir of Dark Souls 1. His appearance and lore seem super cool, but kind of a joke fight. So does he just like clone himself infinitely or something? No. Oh shit, he killed him. Okay. I didn't even see him hit him. The Tomb of the Giants is a pretty scary area, especially on a first playthrough. I'll just go ahead and say it so we get cursed. I do kind of remember the layout of the area, but a lot of the specifics are hard to remember. Byhander, and I think as we start to go down now we get shot at, if we're not being shot at right now. Okay. I thought there was a way to fall there. Shows how well I actually remember that layout. Actually, let's try to be smart for once. Wait, I don't think I have any of the prism stones. That's all of my stones are in Dark Souls 3. I think it's a little bit further to the left. R2. We said we're going to go about this normal style. It's actually going this way. And then we slide down here and make a right. Oh, it's this one, isn't it? That we just drop down. Okay, so I was misremembering where. So now we should be like right by the bonfire. It's like down there, yeah. See, I do kind of remember where I'm going, I just don't remember the specifics. I almost stepped off the cliff right then. Okay.
If I do go hollow, then finish me off. I beg of you.
But at the very least, with Miyazaki's interviews, I mean, I guess it doesn't, like, dispute the idea that, dragons are abyssal. But, he says, like, where'd she go? She really just killed herself. Alright, I am back. Sorry for the delay. So yeah, I remember the description now. You're thinking of the one where it says that they're sympathetic in spirit. It just seems more like to me that they respond to the voices of those that cry out. What item was that? Huh. I don't think it was a key item. Maybe it's a consumable. Definitely not the League. Oh yeah, it'd be the Moon Rune, wouldn't it? Yeah. So the Moon Rune is... The great ones that inhabit the nightmare are sympathetic in spirit and often answer when called upon. So the way that I would take it is that sympathetic in spirit isn't necessarily like they have sympathy. It's more like they resonate with things that call out to them, which is why they respond to them. And it's kind of like got a little bit of religious connotations of like a god answering prayers, I guess. So yeah. Do you believe that Flora was resurrecting the hunter in her boss fight despite wanting them dead is an inconsistency or just a gameplay thing so the third ending isn't too hard to get? Okay, that's a really good question. And also welcome into the stream, Rain Transformed. So part of the reason why I disagree with Smoughtown and his idea of there being a bona fide contract between the hunter and the moon presence is because I tend to believe that the hunter as a concept might predate the moon presence, partially because we have the symbols of the hunter's rune in Pthumerian, when the hunter's dream should have only existed fairly recently on the timeline, or at the very least, the hunter's dream didn't exist in the same capacity as it does now, as it did back in the times of Pthumerian. And I think that the hunter kind of acts as like a Grim Reaper. If anybody has ever seen the movie The Santa Claus with Tim Allen, maybe something quite like that, where you kill the Reaper for a night and then you become the Reaper. Or I think On a Pale Horse by Piers Anthony, or Antony, I don't remember. He has a book kind of like that, which predated the Disney film. But anyway, I think the idea of the hanged men just ties into death in general, and I think the messengers are the dead, and they form a special connection with a good hunter for a period of time, and the role of the hunter is to free spirits that have been trapped into the world and return them to the hunter's dream, which is kind of, I think, hinted at in the crow feather garb attire. So the beak mask. All right, so the first hunter of hunters came from a foreign land and gave the dead a virtuous native funeral ritual rather than impose a blasphemous Yharnam burial service upon them, with the hope that the former compatriots might be returned to the skies and find rest in a hunter's dream. So I think they may have translated this a little bit early to say a hunter's dream rather than like the hunter's dream. But the skies here could also be a reference to heaven in general with this character. Heaven or sky. But it's like the idea of heaven in this character doesn't mean like the Christian sense of heaven. So like sky is an apt enough comparison, or just like the cosmos, I guess, would be another way to think of it. And yeah, so the idea of blood echoes, I think, could predate the Great Ones, especially if you have the view like Smoughtown does that all Great Ones came from humans initially, because the power of the blood echoes, which I think also powers the Great Ones, comes from the power of the dead by virtue of them being blood echoes and the dying wills of people and all that. So that is a good question. Oh, yeah. So to tie that back into the whole thing is, I think the hunter's power comes from like messengers and death in general, rather than the moon presence. And the moon presence might be acting like a hungry parasite, leeching off of the system by draining Gehrman of blood echoes that he gained from the hunter after every night. Which I understand is a bit of a fantastic claim. However, one little bit of a kind of random hidden mechanic of the fight with Gehrman is, if you do beat him in the second ending, you get a bunch of blood echoes, which is, understandable. But for some reason, when you kill him in the third ending, he doesn't drop any blood echoes himself, which doesn't make sense, especially in comparison to the second ending. But maybe it's meant to show that the moon presence had drained him of blood echoes and continues to drain him of blood echoes. That's just kind of my reading on it. It isn't a definitive reading. It's just a differing interpretation between myself and Smoughtown. So just to kind of summarize that all again shortly here, that I think hunters are linked to the dead, and that precedes the moon presence because we have those depictions in Pthumeru, and the moon presence is probably a human perhaps, or something that has kind of infiltrated the system for its own benefit. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. All right. You figured it was a convenience or contrivance? I'm not sure which one you're trying to say. You are about to fight another boss? Oh, probably contrivance with Gehrman. Yeah, that might be true, but I don't know. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and link this back into the chat for you guys in case you didn't give him a like. But yeah, I think this was a very good video, a very tempered video. Obviously, we have disagreements, but I can absolutely appreciate his approach to things here and how clear he makes it when he's either referencing other people's ideas or speaking his own mind rather than trying to state so many things super authoritatively. I don't know why I'm struggling. Okay. The Rain Transform says, if it was draining him of blood echoes in the third ending, why wouldn't it also be doing it in the second one? That's a good question, and my dissatisfactory answer here is that because the game ends after the second one and brings you into New Game Plus, they might have felt it was a little bit too unfair to not give you anything for doing it, but I think that is really shaky, to be fair. Convenience, okay. Do I believe the moon presence controls the doll? I don't think so, because the doll does have that weird connection to Maria, but maybe it was supposed to originally. I don't know. They really pivoted quite a lot from different parts of the story that we saw in parts of the text. So, I don't know. And that's kind of why I have a strong suspicion that the lore of these games is all made up and it doesn't matter. Whose lore is it anyway? All right, so we didn't get any comments about whether you wanted me to go into the next video, so I think we will save that for tomorrow. and we'll watch something else instead, so that way we can give Smoughtown a bit of a more complete package for tomorrow. So what should we watch next? We've got about, 45 minutes plus a little bit after that. Maybe this video by Dangitjm or JM, that's In Defense of Margit, the Fell Omen. That's a good short one. The Tragedy of Dark Souls 3 Bosses. I feel like I would talk a lot about that one. And St. Trina's, I feel like I'd talk about a lot with hers. Okay, so I think we'll do the Dangitjm video, or JM. I always read it as Jim, even though I know it's JM. Or maybe this one. No, let's go Dang It. Because if we don't take too long, I could also talk about Ratatoskrs as well. Okay, we'll do this one. Let me just move this on up. Okay, that'll be fine. Wait, where did I just put it? I'm so blind. Oh, I just put it above it. Okay. Oh, that makes sense. Because we haven't watched this one yet. He does go by Jim, but it's kind of a joke. Okay. Yeah, it's fine if he doesn't cover lore. I'm not focusing entirely on lore. Obviously, it is a heavy focus on my channel, but I think it's fine to look at other stuff too. And Hallucinate, welcome into the stream. Interesting name there. No, it's fine. Okay. What was the Ratatoskr vid? Which one? Was it down here? Oh, so the other one with Margit, you mean? So Margit teaches the most important lesson of all, and I'm assuming it's probably more of a mechanical thing as well. So maybe I'll just put it up there, just to be right there. All right, let's go ahead and dive on in to Dangitjm's Defense of Margit, the Fell Omen, in response to Joseph Anderson. So I have no idea what context we're missing, but I'm assuming he'll probably cover it here.
Unfortunately for you, it is Jim. And let me get something clear out of the way for...
That was unfortunate. I just called him JM. I knew it was Jim. All right.
Unfortunately for you, it is Jim. And let me get something clear out of the way first. You're probably reading the title and are thinking, ooh, spicy drama. No, this is not a call-out video. I'm not trying to clown on anybody. I'm not trying to designate that certain gamers are less skilled or of bad moral character because they have a different opinion than me. Folks looking for drama or unnecessary gotchas need not enter. I only want to respond to certain ideas being thrown out there. So,
all right, looks like we'll need to watch another video after all. No, I'm kidding.
Some folks might have past grievances with previous takes of the individual I'm about to talk about today. I specifically want to talk about some of the Elden Ring takes. Not all of them, mind you. I want to be crystal clear about what I'm going to be responding to today. If I were to respond to everything I disagreed with, then the video would be far too long, and I don't quite have the time to pull something like that off, at least yet anyway. So for now, let's get into it. We are responding to a direct quote from Joseph TGI Fridays Anderson in his Elden Ring critique video. Let's cut straight to the skinny of it and start with the portion where he talks about the late game boss design. I don't want to talk about all the late game bosses because some of them are still in the spoiler field. I want to keep a majority of what I talk about on the channel still spoiler free until maybe another month down the line, and then I'll start referencing names and talking about what is to come. But for now, let's get into it. Anderson's biggest issue with the game, period, is that some bosses had optional extensions on combos that they sometimes only do if you attack them. Later on, Anderson goes on to say the following: in Dark Souls 1 through 3, he could learn almost every pattern, and even though he'd mess up now and then, he knew it was his mistake, and if he tried hard enough, he could actively engage the boss and deal damage without ever getting hit himself. In Sekiro, you can respond to everything while doing that damage. In Elden Ring, his patience was being tested to wait and wait and wait, and then hopefully his Witcher 3 video comes out and there wasn't some secret extension to the combo he was punishing that he didn't know about. Hopefully the boss didn't dice roll on resisting a stagger or randomly decide to dodge away from his hit, denying the opportunity he had to wait so long for.
So before Jim goes into his critique of this, I want to say that I absolutely understand and can commiserate with Joseph Anderson's opinion here. I obviously do think it's a little bit of hyperbole, but I do think there is a very large kernel of truth to what they're saying here. And the way that I would phrase it is certainly that there's a large component of skill and pattern recognition that goes into it, and you can still understand the enemy's patterns and capitalize on them. In Elden Ring, I'm not trying to deny that. However, I think the core of what Joseph Anderson is trying to convey is he feels he feels like Elden Ring's bosses are fundamentally different in the way they interact with the player than in previous games. And I think some people might take his comments a bit too literally and overlook the kind of impression that Elden Ring had on him as opposed to the other games. So, though I was going to say, even without like the boss title, the title of this video, the boss that immediately comes to mind when I think of bosses that have a kind of ridiculous amount of combos and they're hard to have a proper back and forth with in a Dark Souls kind of style is definitely Margit, and then Malekith is another one. Malenia is actually mostly fine except for her kind of bullcrap mechanic and waterfowl dance specifically. But if she didn't have waterfowl dance, she would be a hell of a lot more manageable, but she would still be really annoying, and there's some certain other aspects of her design which could have used refinement for sure. But anyway, so for me, Margit and Malekith are like the poster boy children of having too much going on, and they feel like they were designed with spirit ashes in mind, which is perfectly fine and perfectly valid, but it does feel like less of a curated experience than the kind of boss fights that were present in the other games. And I think that's because they were just tuned with having something else to take aggro away from the player. And so does one want to blame players for not utilizing that mechanic, or do we want to blame the developers for not thinking about those kinds of players? Could be part of a broader conversation about this topic. But so far, pretty good, straightforward start here. So let's see where this goes.
He knows there is a way to do these fights hitless if he was patient enough, or if he built himself to burst the bosses down quickly, but like he said at the start of the section, that makes him feel like he was playing the game wrong. Because it's not about it being too hard, it's that it's not fun. It's boring. And he's not trying to weasel out of saying that it's not too hard. It is too hard, that is the problem, but it's that it's so hard in a way that makes it not fun. He would love this level of difficulty if it was engaging, but it's not, because it involves so much waiting. End quote. I of course had to change some pronouns around in order to make it stick. But
I appreciate the direct commentary about that there. So no, I think what Joseph Anderson said right there is pretty much exactly what I was intuiting. So I'm curious to see where Jim goes with this kind of a commentary. And I think it is important to note that for Joseph Anderson, it's not fun. And I'm very curious to see how Jim is going to respond to that, because you can't exactly logic your way into fun, if that makes sense.
engaging, but it's not, because it involves so much waiting. End quote. I of course had to change some pronouns around in order to make it stick, but now let's get into it. During this section, Anderson himself used footage of the Margit fight, who is actually an early game boss, not a late game boss. When he was describing how he had to wait for the late game bosses to finish their attack string, seemingly for little payoff, you would see footage of Margit appear. Who knows if including Margit in this section was an editing mistake or an intentional point, but I wanted to respond to this specific idea by making some challenge run videos specifically with Margit. The first video I made the other day included a 2-minute fight with Margit.
Just to kind of defend Joseph Anderson there, I mean, Margit is kind of a late game boss in that you can face him as Morgott as well. But nonetheless, I do understand that kind of a discrepancy there. Teen Sith thinks Margit is fine. And Rain Transformed is talking about only Melania can get out of staggers. So yeah, like I was saying, I don't think it's truly conducive to the broader conversation to get like stuck on the details there, when I think the main takeaway of Joseph Anderson's complaints is that he was not having fun with the interactions of the bosses. So I don't necessarily know if you can convince somebody that they're having fun when they feel like they're not, but we might be able to make other people gain a better appreciation for these kinds of bosses that they may have found frustrating. That might be the angle that could be a bit more relevant here. I don't know. You also find it odd to complain about it as if it was an Elden Ring specific issue, that doing hit lists on bosses is unfun. There's plenty of bosses in the rest of the series that get ruined on hit lists. That's probably a bit fair, but I think the core of Joseph Anderson's argument is that he probably feels that the hit list runs for him specifically in the other games were more enjoyable than attempts on this one. Although I don't know if he actually really ever attempted them. I'm just kind of guessing that he thinks that Elden Ring's bosses feel different than the other bosses of the previous games, which is going to be hard to talk about because it's kind of a subjective viewpoint here. Elden Ring feels like it's trying to be easy for new players, but also hard for veterans at the same time. The case in point are Margit's whack timings. Literally whack timings, in terms of it being a verb and a adjective.
Margit that featured me getting hit, mistiming some rolls, and attacking at inopportune times, but the main purpose of that first clip I made was to show that there wasn't much waiting at all in the fight, especially when I was using an Zweihander. In the fight, it was fun. I was having fun. Surely the impression of fun having would come across from the gameplay itself. And alas, after quite a few responses in the comments, I now realize that I need to actually voice out what is going on there. And with enough encouragement, I in fact redid the Margit fight, but this time without getting hit, and still there was little to no waiting. It was in fact not boring. But let's break down what's happening. From Anderson's own words, in Dark Souls 1 through 3, he could learn almost every pattern, and even though he'd still mess up now and then, he knew it was his mistake, and if he tried hard enough, he could actively engage the boss and deal damage without ever getting hit himself. Key words here, to me, actively engage the boss. Surely the following clip speaks for itself. I'm directly responding to the idea that there are periods of waiting with absolutely nothing going on. Because in my clip, when there was distance between me and Margit, and he's just edge walking to the side, I either threw a jar, I threw knives. In the clip where I got hit, I tried to look for a way to heal, I was doing running attacks, or I was repositioning myself as to provoke a more favorable attack from Margit, an attack that could be punished. All of that movement, all of the button presses, that is active participation, at least in my book.
So I think Jim is right, and he's also wrong by proxy of making a bit of a false equivalency here. So he's absolutely factually correct here in saying his fights with Margit involved a hell of a lot more action and very little to no waiting. However, his experiences could differ from Joseph Anderson's due to his build. I'm assuming Jim is going to say that like he did different type of build options to kind of highlight that it's not just this thing specifically. However, unless he's using like Joseph Anderson's build options, it's kind of hard to say that his experience is going to be what Joseph Anderson's experience should have been. And even then, I do think it's very obvious that Jim has a much fuller understanding of the Margit fight than Joseph Anderson. So one thing to keep in mind is also that I think Joseph Anderson was going at this in a bit of a blind playthrough and like maybe a first playthrough commentary on how it felt fighting these bosses versus the reality of being able to cheese or defeat any boss hitless, which like, yeah, I mean, look at the Happy Hob. My mans will literally play through every game in the like Soulsborne FromSoft catalog and beat them hitless, you know, like it's definitely possible, but that doesn't mean it's fun for everybody. And fun is that kind of subjective thing, which is so difficult to talk about. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is because of Jim's much fuller understanding of the game in general and as well as the boss fight, he doesn't feel quite the same level of pressure in using these kind of consumables than I think somebody less familiar with the games would. And a lot of people don't like to use consumables because they're very limited in FromSoft games. You get punished for screwing up a hell of a lot more using consumables than you do just swinging and banging, you know? He went big with the Zweihander, yeah. And of course, like the Zweihander is really good for like poise damage. But like one thing which like I think really just shows the difference between the level of Jim's knowledge and Joseph Anderson's knowledge, I'm assuming, is how he literally jumped into Margit's attack because he knew that he would poise break him and get the kind of visceral attack off wherever it was. I think it's like right here.
Without
okay.
And if he tried hard enough, he could actively
this
engage
one right
the boss
here
and deal damage.
So, like, look at that hitbox. Let's back up a little bit more. Like, how many frames? Like 3 or 4 frames before he would have gotten hit. Like this is a massive level of mastery on this boss. So, just kind of a bit of a discrepancy, I think, between their experiences playing the game and dealing with the boss for the first time. I think I started to mention reaction times and I got distracted because I remembered the other points that I wanted to make. But it might also be worth considering that the reaction speed or of Joseph Anderson as well as other people might be slower than Jim's, which is an unfortunate truth of just gaming in general, that some people might be better at reading what the enemies are doing and reacting to them in a more timely fashion, which gives them a massive edge over players who are a little less familiar with the controls and a little less familiar with the telegraphs of enemy attacks. So, like I was saying, I don't think Jim is actually wrong here, but I don't think it's fair to expect this level of knowledge to be applied to other people when the game isn't clicking for them initially. Like, Joseph doesn't have that skill set built into him yet because of just the lack of knowledge. Have you watched a Dark Souls vet try to learn Sekiro for the first time? It's painful. I lived it. People hate having to adjust. It's true. And I mean, it took me a really long time to adjust to Bloodborne. Like, I did not understand the rally mechanic the entire first time I played through the game. Like, it literally clicked for me when I was fighting the moon presence and I noticed my health went back up after it did the full-on life HP drain attack. I was like, wait a second, what? Like, we get told it kind of in a vague way, but it's a very big difference being told it versus like living it and having such a large feedback window to kind of internalize it. What's Scarseal? Oh yeah, and yeah, that's another good point. Like, his build is totally catered for this. I mean, I was going to leave this Zweihander thing alone because I'm not going to say, oh, it's an OP weapon. But I mean, my man's is using this weapon for a specific reason, and he knows how to use it. So I figure he's probably going to compare this with like a different style of challenge, I would assume. Joe left a comment on the video's comment section, but you don't know if it's still up, but it brought up interesting points. Okay. And yeah, I do know that Jim is very big into PvP. Okay. Thank you all for those comments.
deal damage without ever getting hit himself.
Let's go forward.
The idea, because in my for a way to heal,
All right.
for Anderson would then be, what are we waiting for? But this is something else we do have to make note of. Anderson purposefully gave himself several limitations during his first playthrough. He was using colossal weaponry. He was not using ranged weaponry. He wasn't using any consumables or additional tools, with some exceptions, etc., etc. In summary, he did as he claims he always did in the previous Souls games. He ran a melee-only strength build. He then took great lengths at critiquing Elden Ring based on this melee-only first experience. One moment he says that he was aware of his limits in past games with boss fights and would even get hit because of it. And in spite of getting hit, he said he would still have fun. But then, it doesn't seem as if he wants to extend that same effort to Elden Ring, a game that is practically asking the player to rewire their mentality and change old habits from previous Souls games to find those openings, to find the fun. There is one point of contention that needs a lot of clearing up too, the idea of melee-only builds. In previous Souls games, it can be argued that melee builds did not need any sort of ranged option. And by ranged option, I don't just mean bows or crossbows, but things like throwing knives or bombs, items that can be placed on your quick item hotbar, which is typically allotted to the square button or X on Xbox controllers. But now you have additional tools that you can put on your triangle button if you hold it down, or Y on Xbox controllers. There's now 4 additional inputs for options, for tools, for consumables right at your fingertips. Because hear me out. If there was a better time for melee-only builds to adopt throwing jars or throwing knives into their playstyles, then Elden Ring is the game. There are jars that are both strength scaling or dex scaling that are for the big sword builds and the small quick builds. There are status effects for jars. There are status effects for knives. Poison knives, sleep jars. There are unique throwing options like kukris and fan daggers. There are even bewitching branches that can turn the gank boss fights into something much more manageable. The options for complementary tools are the largest there have ever been in a Soulsborne game. But here's the real kicker. Souls veterans had to rewire their mentality and habits for Sekiro when that game flipped the script on players all those years ago. Take, for instance, the addition of the new posture bar and the existence of shinobi tools, which Anderson himself in his video classifies as being similar to magic or consumables from Dark Souls. So now I have to ask, why can't we do the same rewiring for Elden Ring? Especially when in the tutorials they make it a point to describe how you can break enemy stances in the game, which is definitely an imported Sekiro mechanic.
So I do think the big difference between like Sekiro and Elden Ring and like the Dark Souls stuff ties back into how secondary the prosthetic tools really are. Obviously, you can rely on them to a certain degree, but really, you can more or less complete the game without needing to interact with them beyond like very cursory level experiences. Like maybe the axe would be like a really good kind of pseudo required one. The shuriken you don't really need, but it's useful. Like they're all useful. Firecrackers are extremely useful, but you don't need to use it. So it's kind of hard to say. Like even though Sekiro does challenge the way that players played the games, I mean if you plan the strength build, the melee build, not really. So Sekiro is probably a hell of a lot more challenging to casters, I would argue, than melee builds. Not that I really think that's that important in terms of like disagreeing with Jim or Joseph Anderson with their like preferred approach to the games. I do think both of these guys are kind of right in that Elden Ring does give you way more tools to deal with these bosses, but I also think Joseph Anderson's opinion has value in saying that his current melee experience is not what he expected based off of previous titles, and he's not found Elden Ring as captivating as a result of these kind of new design choices. That doesn't mean these design choices are invalidated. It just means that they aren't resonating with Joseph Anderson the way that they did in previous titles, which is unfortunate, but I mean, it's a bit of a reality just because times change and people need to adapt. So, like I've been saying, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I do feel like certain bosses feel a little cheap, and that Elden Ring doesn't provide as curated an experience with 1v1 boss battles as previous titles. I still think they're fun, and that you can have fun with the multiple different ways you can approach these fights, but I also think Elden Ring could have been improved in certain other ways. So, the posture system could have been elaborated on, especially for like newer players. I don't know if Joseph Anderson did play Sekiro. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt that he did, but if he didn't, I certainly wouldn't expect him to be able to keep pressure on enemies which he's having a hard time reading and responding to keep the posture bar low enough to get consistent staggers the way that Jim is, who seems to have like a really, really solid understanding of the games. And also, if we compare perhaps the similar time frame in which these two players played Elden Ring, I'm curious as to how different their experiences were, because Joseph Anderson is talking about his first impressions, whereas Jim is talking about the game from an angle of, I'm assuming, probably over 100 hours, being conservative. I know he's very big into PvP. I don't know when this video got released. Let's go ahead and check. 1 year ago? April 19th? Okay, so maybe around 100 hours, if we're being generous, because that was pretty short after the release there. So anyway, not the biggest of deals there, but just the experience between them is vastly different. So Jim is right in saying, like, you can interact with these bosses completely different ways, but I do think it's a little bit unfair to try to point out to people that they need to play completely differently than they used to, because that's not what they expected going into this. So you could blame them on having expectations that did not meet reality, but I don't know. I think both are kind of valid in their feelings here. You can buy almost all the mats for crafting consumables. All right, and that was the other thing I wanted to mention. You thought Sekiro had a major sequence with like the spark tool? You forget what it's called. He did note that Joseph Anderson self-admittedly put a bunch of arbitrary limitations on himself when he didn't have to, which is probably influencing the fun factor. Right. And the one thing that I did want to mention with regards to that goes back into the costs it takes to maintain a kind of build where you're able to naturally keep using your kind of consumables. You need to not die very often, so that way you don't have to spend a lot more resources in staying topped off for these kind of consumables. But of course, that'll be more reserved for bosses, and just goes back into the whole like experience thing that I was talking about a moment ago, where you'll know how to deal with the smaller enemies well enough where you don't need to waste a lot of consumables on them, and you want to keep piling on the pressure to the bosses. And of course, like, the more you die, the further behind it puts you on with levels, as well as the runes necessary to keep on top of the consumables. So it's just a lot more expensive if you don't know what you're doing. So I would say, like, the games actively punish people for using their consumables because they don't get them back. So why continue to use consumables when you know you'll run out? If anybody's anything like me, which I hope not, because I'm like a freaking hoarder in video games when it comes to consumable items, they kind of get disincentivized from using them quite a lot of the time until they feel like they absolutely need to. Of course, that is also a bit of a generalization on my part, and I certainly know many players burn through their consumables like candy, just to be fair. Stance break is also in Dark Souls, at least for human enemies. Yes, to a degree, but it is a lot more robust in Elden Ring and not as set up. Like with Dark Souls, you would hit an enemy like a couple times and then their shield could fly back. Whereas this one, there's a lot less visual indication of that, or there's a lot more setup to go along with it for at least the big boys. Yeah. I wasn't trying to say like the firecrackers are required, but I just mean like in terms of an all-purpose prosthetic tool, that's probably amongst the best for a brand new player of Sekiro, where they don't really understand the intricacies of each item. And Team Sith did talk about their experience where they struggle with anything that's not like the Carrion Spellblade style stuff, and that it's a bit weird of a mindset to them because they designed multiple base experiences in the starting classes, and there's help text in a lot of the games with the SL1 starter to the effect of, we don't recommend doing this your first time. Yeah, and so that's the other thing that's a really good point to bring up, that from the beginning, you're kind of led to believe that there's different valid play styles, and the more melee-oriented builds aren't typically paired with like these kind of consumables, so it's a little less intuitive to use them, even though I do think Jim is right that there's way more access to them in Elden Ring than in previous titles. You missed the old jump attacks in Bloodborne? I mean, after having the jump attacks in Elden Ring, it's kind of hard to go back. They're just so OP. You always finish your RPGs with 99 elixirs? Yeah. I remember getting to the final boss of Final Fantasy VII and having an internal struggle of whether or not I should use an elixir, because in my mind, I'm like, wait, I might need this later, and when I'm literally at the final boss.
Throwing knives and throwing jars can also keep a boss's stance or posture constantly damaged and pressured, prone to breaking, just like how shurikens kept on the pressure in Sekiro. Basically, if we were to treat Elden Ring like it was the child, the offspring between Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro, I bet we would all find a bit more success. Being able to adapt and find new ways to succeed is a point that is incredibly important, yet, from what I can tell, is vastly overlooked. I will have to admit, though, this reintroduction of older mechanics like the Sekiro posture bar lends itself to a new problem. From Software might not have communicated the importance and the effectiveness of using these tools and taking advantage of the stance system in Elden Ring all that well. Yes, we can craft. Yes, we can use these consumables on a melee character. But if the core combat of Elden Ring feels so familiar to something like Dark Souls 3, I actually wouldn't doubt that some players would still want to treat Elden Ring like it is Dark Souls 3, the sequel. The fact that there is no visible...
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think some other stuff to tie into Elden Ring and its tutorialization specifically is that compared to Sekiro, there's a lot less setup for how these consumables and tools work. So you can go to the Cave of Knowledge and whatnot, but you're never really given like throwing knives to throw at targets to like stun them, or things of that nature, or ways like different ways you can use pots, whether they be like the forward throwing ones or the backward throwing. You also have to very gradually build up getting your supply of like cracked pots and perfume bottles. So depending on the way you go through the world, you might not actually even have these tools the first time you face Margit, specifically if you like literally follow the sites of grace, which point you straight to him. So there is a bit of an interplay here, and of course you can make the very valid argument was like, why the hell do you keep fighting Margit, you idiot? The game is kind of giving you the hint to go back and explore the world so that way you could get better. But if players don't know that, or if they're stubborn and don't want to feel as though they're being defeated, they might just keep ramming, pun intended, their head against Margit until it either clicks or it doesn't. And there's a good possibility that Margit won't click for a lot of players because he is by far the most difficult kind of intro boss in a FromSoft game that they've ever released. So people thought like Papa G was bad in Bloodborne, but Margit is magnitudes worse just because of how well he combos attacks and makes them a little bit hard to read at times, and how well he varies his timing between attacks to punish people who either like panic roll or things like that. So I think he's a fantastic boss in a certain sense, but I do think he has too much going on, especially for a first boss experience in Elden Ring. Yeah, I know you can farm mega elixirs. It's just, my problem. Yeah, I don't think I was using the W item bug at that time. Things like fire pots were crucial parts of the previous games. Jim's point isn't very different than the reasoning given to use fire bombs in Dark Souls 1. I do think Jim's position is a bit different for Elden Ring because crafting is a lot more of an in-your-face experience, although it could have been improved. So if there was like more tutorialization of like, hey, craft this, hey, use this, kind of like what you do like in an MMO or like Sekiro, it's like, hey, you got shuriken. They're really good against these enemies that jump around. Hey, Lady Butterfly, she jumps around a lot, huh? So that kind of stuff. Or in Sekiro, it's like, hey, you get the axe. This axe is really good for breaking against shields that your sword can't go through. So there's a lot more reason to use the tools in Sekiro than there ever are in Elden Ring. So he's kind of right where if you combine the ideas behind Sekiro in with the gameplay of Dark Souls, you do get something more like Elden Ring, but you don't have the tutorialization of Sekiro to go along with that. And to be fair, I do think like Sekiro's tutorial isn't the best, and that the real tutorial boss is Genichiro, who's like literally like in the halfway point of the game, where it's like you either sink or you swim until you beat him. Yeah, Papa G's beast phase is the problem. And even Papa G is kind of like a gimmick boss because you can use the music box. And I guess Margit is similar, but that's also predicated on you going out of your way to get to patches rather than like Kale carrying the shackle, which could give you a bit of a hint as to how to deal with him a bit more effectively, which doesn't like invalidate him or like make him a true gimmick boss. It's just like the experiences offered in Elden Ring vary so widely from the different games in the past that it is a little bit of apples and oranges in some ways. The only reason you found Margit hard was because of the worst head cold you had at the time of your life? Yeah. Like I said, the first time I played through it, I had been exploring a lot. I was also using summons, but after I killed him on my first try, I felt it was a little bit cheap. So I stopped using summons unless there was like a multi-enemy boss, and then I had more fun. So I didn't have the initial impression of him being as hard as he actually was until later on. Rain Transformed said, his main argument is that it's stupid to not use consumables to make things easier for yourself if you're not doing a challenge run. No, I understand that, but my point is that these games kind of punish people too heavily for using these consumables, even still in Elden Ring. So people are disinclined to use them, and it does get compounded with the fact that unless you're exploring a lot, your options are also limited. So you need to know where to get like the pots to begin with, and like the crafting recipes to go with that as well. So there is, it's not as straightforward as that, but I think there's elements of truth to it. Like, it's not completely wrong, but I think there's just extenuating circumstances. Yeah, and you have to explore a lot to get the consumables. And then, oh yeah, that's a really good point, Rain Transformed. That itself raises the question of whether a boss is well designed if you need consumables to make it tolerable, but that's not brought up at all in the video, unfortunately. That is a very good point. So just because you can use consumables to keep the pressure on, does that justify using them or not? I don't know. I don't think you have to use it. I think he's just saying this makes it easier. Why don't you make it easier on yourself? But I think Joseph Anderson is valid for saying, like, I don't like to use these because they don't really match my preferred gaming experience of like being a knight or like a melee user or like a brain dead barbarian with a big ass club. Who knows, you know? So yeah, that's kind of how I feel. Asked Next, that it would be nice if they gave us like a set amount of consumables, and maybe like not consumables, but just like items that don't vanish completely. You would argue that you need at least a few levels and an upgraded weapon for Margit to not be a headache. Yeah. So anyway, all right, enough of this kind of soapbox tangent. Let's go back to the video. And thanks for all your comments. They've been really insightful and easy to bounce off of. You once tried to parry Margit. Did not end well.
Visible posture meter, for instance, like it was in Sekiro, can only add to this feeling that you're just playing a more spruced up old Souls game. But rest assured, there is a posture stance meter that is working. Especially when you're using counterattacks, jumping attacks, charged attacks, colossal weapons, etc., etc. Knowing to break old habits would require more experimentation, more research, and more community support so that we all can better understand and appreciate the game we have in our hands. But here's one more thing. Something that I've seen a few comments bring up is the fact that there are RNG-based attacks from bosses that can't possibly be predicted or sight-read as easily in Elden Ring.
All right, before he goes into that point, I did want to just address that literally needing more experimentation and needing research for the very first boss in a game is kind of garbage. Just, I'm going to say it like flat out there. Like, it's garbage how difficult Margit is if you fight him directly very early on. So, what does that mean in the broader context of Elden Ring if that fight is garbage when it's kind of telling you to go to that way, like, immediately? You're either supposed to intrinsically get the idea that you need to go out and explore, or you might internalize the idea that this is just the base difficulty of the game, and neither are super intuitive when the game points you this direction to begin with. So, anyway.
More community support hands are RNG-based attacks from bosses that can't possibly be predicted or sight-read as easily in Elden Ring. Mr. Anderson himself refers to these moves as dice roll attacks. And I think we're hitting the crux of another issue here. How can players avoid the worst attacks from bosses, attacks that they seemingly cannot react to because they are so fast or don't have any obvious tells, and still, how can those same players bait more favorable attacks that they can actually punish? Now, this would require individual guides from boss to boss because I don't want to overgeneralize. So for now, let's specifically talk about Margit. As I played more the other night and did the hitless Zweihander run against him, I found out that throwing knives or jars would bait aggression from Margit and interrupt his typical edge walk to the sides. You don't have to fully accept the possibility of being hit by a quote-unquote dice roll dagger because you are now bringing him toward you and provoking a different response altogether. These different attacks that he does throw out, which could be a leap, the dual-wield hammer strikes, the spinning sword sweeps, they all can be sight-read a lot easier than these quick dagger swipes. This is all assuming that you don't want to get hit in the fight, by the way. For bigger colossal weapon users, you might want to take hits because you want to hit them with a weapon art or something like that. But for now, let's assume that you don't want to get hit. The question I have for you is, if the player can bait the boss to do anything but those high-risk moves, those coin toss attacks, what is stopping the player from doing so? In my opinion, I still think there are ways to not only do these fight hitless, but to have
So just to go back to his rhetorical question, I've said it like a handful of times at this point. I think it's because the game disincentivizes people from using consumables, as well as like the scarcity of getting them and the knowledge of how they even interact with bosses specifically, just because people are way more likely to run out before they have enough knowledge to know how bosses get affected by them, you know? At least Gascoigne becomes a pushover even without the music box when you realize that he's very easily staggered from even basic attacks and doesn't do much damage. Well, I feel like Papa G, and this kind of goes back into Jim's point here, is really weak to fire. So if you stack a couple of the Molotov cocktails that you can very easily pick up in Central Yharnam, you can kill him very quickly when he gets to the beast phase, if you save them for that phase. But again, that also presupposes that you haven't died in the attempt a couple times and you still have beast pots on hand. And Bloodborne is probably the worst in those games just because it costs money to get more heals, or it takes a lot longer to farm to get your heals, and they aren't given to you intrinsically. And Demon Souls is a little bit comparable, but heals are just much more plentiful, and it's a much slower game. Beans and Rice feels that FromSoft always makes games for people who like to tinker, and can non-tinkerers play and enjoy the game? Certainly, yeah. However, you think From games are most made for people who most enjoy interesting questions? I feel like that's a little bit of a... I don't want to say like bait for this channel, but something along those lines. Like, this is probably not the best spot to generalize about that, just because of this kind of audience. Arguing that just because you can bait a boss into doing only safe attacks with consumable spam means that it's actually fine is kind of a garbage argument. I think so a little bit as well. I think he's right here, but I think it's also predicated on a level of knowledge far, far, far beyond the newest players into the games, and even veterans to a certain degree, just because of how much it was beaten into me to not use consumables unless I knew they were going to work in the previous games. You don't think Jim is talking about whether something is fun? Yeah. You also don't think Margit is a poorly designed boss fight? I don't think he's poorly designed. I think he could have just used tuning, and he's just too early of a boss fight. I do think there's a couple moves that are like a little bit oppressive, but again, you can mitigate them just like Jim is saying here. But just, yeah, no need to keep rehashing what I'm saying there.
What is stopping the player from doing so? In my opinion, I still think there are ways to not only do these fight hit lists, but to have fun while doing it. As we're wrapping up here, I want to make it clear that I don't think that Mr. Anderson is playing incorrectly. No. Rather, I do think he might be playing by the incorrect game's rules. In Elden Ring specifically, I don't think there is such a thing as a melee-only build anymore. If you are going melee-only, that is a melee-only limitation, and a self-imposed one at that. Now keep in mind, if you've made it this far in the video, I want to get that out there that I'm not trying to defend every boss in the Elden Ring lineup. There are some that I definitely have issues with and my own grievances with. I'm saving that for another day. Specifically today, I was talking about Margit. I hope y'all understand. Anderson himself...
Yeah, I can respect that aspect of it, but I would just also disagree that the melee builds are dead because Elden Ring is a different game. Like, sure, fundamentally, I understand where he's coming from with that, but the game, I don't think, does the best job articulating that, and because of that fact, that kind of makes... I don't want to say like they're poorly designed, but... So the boss itself isn't poorly designed. I would say like the game itself that leads you into that boss is a bit poorly designed. So, spoiler alert, I don't actually think Elden Ring is a masterpiece because it has a lot of the failings of its previous brethren. But I still do think it's a really good game in general. So yeah, let's go back into the vid.
Himself said several times in this video that he no longer had fun fighting some of the bosses in Elden Ring. And for now, I can't say the same. At this fork in the road, we're at an impasse. 2 months after the game's release, I'm still digging into these fights and reassessing why I like the thing.
And so I do wonder what build Joseph Anderson was using. Maybe I should like go back and watch their video, or like if there's an article, read the article. But I do think it's a little bit unfair that Jim only used the Zweihander in their challenge run. Now, not just say like, oh, like you should use exactly what Joseph was using and like limit yourself to melee only. Sure, maybe you don't need to go that far, but maybe Joseph Anderson is a fan of daggers, and daggers just function differently. Like daggers typically scale better with bleed, and you don't rely on staggers. Although, like, bleed does kind of pseudo-stagger. It's a different mechanic. But anyway, not every weapon is going to be effective in getting the job done as safely. Or maybe that's kind of like a false equivalency there. It's just like you're going to have very different experiences. And some are more manageable depending on your build and your loadout. Which is kind of what Jim is getting at. But I'm a little bit surprised he didn't expand upon that a bit more, or try to argue that, like, well, yeah, I guess if we wanted to be uncharitable to Jim and extend his argument further, you could also make the argument that, hey, if you're not using consumables, you should use consumables. Hey, if you're not using the Zweihander, you should use the Zweihander, to the point where you're kind of taking a lot of agency away from players in the way that they're approaching the game, which I know I'm being like really negative against Jim here, but I'm not trying to like shoot him down or like say like he's making terrible arguments. I'm trying to say like I don't think that fully encompasses the broader conversation around this topic. Not to say that even like what we're offering in chat is the full spectrum of experiences either. You think Jim mentioned the other guy was doing the Naked Man Big Sword build? Oh yeah, he did say Colossals. Okay, that's fair. So okay, yeah, using the Zweihander is a bit more fair there. Thanks for reminding me, Tinseth. And Okiman. And also welcome into the stream. Thanks, I forgot about that. Alright. That makes way more sense. Okay.
On the flip side, Mr. Anderson has made it clear that he has no desire to redo some of the fights, and that his first playthrough of the game has tarnished his impressions of any further attempt. So again, we're at an impasse. What more can be said? For now, though, that's it for me. Again, keep it amicable in the comments. I'm not trying to start any beef here. I only want to wrestle with ideas, not people, unless it's pro wrestling, then hell yeah. But more importantly, when it comes to these kinds of games, I think it is immensely exhilarating and satisfying to find new ways to appreciate and understand what makes these games tick. That is the true purpose of this video. Perhaps there is something here that y'all have even learned that you can now take with you on your own Soulsborne journeys. If I see any of y'all trying to start something because you hold grievances with some unrelated Joseph Anderson take, I might end up deleting your comment because I don't want to see them. Stay focused. Stay on topic, please. That's the only time I'm asking you. Everyone else, thank you for watching. If you have any insight of your own, feel free to leave some. But until then, take care of you and yours. I'll see y'all when I see y'all. Peace.
Yeah, so I actually really enjoyed that video, even if I do have some like vehement disagreements or differences of opinions here. So I'm going to go ahead and link this into chat. Obviously, this is my first video that I've seen by Jim because he does like a lot more PvP stuff, but that's kind of the fun of exploring what other content creators have been making over the years. So here you guys go. That's the link if you want to give him a like and a sub. So I might look at this off stream. Oh, that's a full video? I'm a little bit curious how long this is.
So in this game, your Geralt has the title of Tarnished.
Okay,
His roach is now named
Oh my
Florence,
god!
But you still kill monsters.
Okay, maybe that's just... What is up with these subs? Oh, I think I know what happened. Oh no.
I have more issues with this game than any other FromSoft has released in this spiritual series of theirs, yes, including Dark Souls 2. Yet I can't lie and have to state equally plainly that Elden Ring has some of the best moments I've ever had in a game. Sekiro is still my favorite over all of these, but when it comes to exploration and
Alright, so if somehow Joseph Anderson sees this, which I kind of doubt just based on the size of this and like all that, you don't have the auto timings on for your actual legitimate subtitles. So people, we just had like that gigantic box of text.
In this game, your Geralt has the title of Tarnished.
Oh yeah, I put on the auto ones now. Anyway, I might look at this sometime eventually later. Not on stream perhaps because it's extremely long and not lore, but maybe we will. I don't know. We'll figure it out. So anyway, back to Jim's video. I do think it was well produced. He does have good arguments. I just think there are some other things we can consider that go along with them. And as some people in chat, like the Rain Transformed, were saying, just because you can interact with the game this like in certain ways, does that actually make it quote unquote good? And I think that's a fair comment to make and could require a bit further justification. Whereas I tend to focus more on like the systemic stuff where I feel like even if we like look beyond that stuff, like how much does the game set the player up for success and going along with that? So lots of very small moving parts which kind of all work together to create this entangled mess of boss fights in general. And of course, that was Margit specifically, and I am a little bit curious about Jim's takes on the other bosses, which apparently Joseph Anderson was also talking about. So for me, the two most problematic bosses that come to mind in terms of like legibility are Margit and Malekith, and also like that ties into spacing as well. Also Rykard. Yeah, Rykard can be extremely bad. I still have no idea how you're actually supposed to completely dodge all of his garbage without like staggering him in like his second phase, or without using like immutable shield or whatnot it is, like whatever it's called, that makes you completely immune. You do think it's odd for Joseph Anderson to judge Elden Ring's bosses based solely off his first run, to be fair? You need to experiment in order to fully understand whether a boss is good or not. I think to a degree you're right, but I would also disagree quite heavily because for most players, they're probably only going to have a first experience of the game, and for many players, it will be an incomplete first experience of the game. So giving people your thoughts about that first experience can have immense value to people who aren't going to go through and play the game multiple times. Bella says, people have a problem with Malekith. You're a bit biased since he's one of your favorite bosses, but what are the criticisms towards him? So, yeah, my problem with Malekith is that he has no HP. So, for me specifically, it's really mostly the first phase, which I find like kind of obnoxious with just as how fast he is for like a melee character and how well he weaves in and out of attacks. So obviously you can bait him to do certain things and all that, and it's manageable, but it's just not as fun of an experience, especially with as many projectiles he can use at mid-range and just the speed with which he moves. It's the window to punish a lot of his attacks is much smaller, which is a little bit more frustrating. But, you know, again, it's still manageable. I beat Malekith. We got through the ordeal. So, as far as the second phase goes, I do actually prefer that aspect of his fight. Although I do think the Blasphemous Claw is a little bit of a noob trap, where it's a lot easier for me to deal with the boss by not trying to fish for the parries at all and just punish him for his whiffs. But, I mean, some people use the Blasphemous Claw to great effect, but I was not one of them, at least on my first playthrough. I've gotten better as I've gone through it, but I didn't exactly pick up immediately that the attacks one can parry are specifically the ones that are imbued with gold, because that just was not obvious to me. I was trying to parry like all of his attacks, and I was getting frustrated that the stupid claw didn't work. And yeah, that's kind of how I feel about Rykard as well, Okimin. or Omen, I don't know, that the spectacle of Rykard outshined any problems that you had with his weirder attacks. Yeah. So the way that I feel about Rykard is I absolutely love that gimmick fight because I think it's the best form of that gimmick fight specifically that they've done. However, I do feel like Rykard is more of a vigor check than anything else, which is just that ain't it. Like, they were so close to greatness, it infringes on it, and it just doesn't quite get there for me. All right, so rather than ending right now with Ratatoskr's video being like 5 minutes and still on Margit, I'm going to go ahead and power through a bit.
Hello and welcome, this is Ratatoskr, and today let's talk about Margit, the Fell Omen. Oh man, do I like Margit, the Fell Omen. Margit is significantly harder than anything in the surrounding regions. He's the first story-relevant boss that you fight in the game, and his fight makes clear that he's a cut above the rest of the various mini-dungeon bosses that you might have found on the way to him. Margit has high HP, he does big boy damage, his move pool is very diverse. He has several delayed high damage attacks that will punish severely panic rolling, and he also has fast instantaneous attacks that will catch you unaware. And to top it all off, he gets more moves during his second phase, many of which are harder to avoid and do a lot more damage. Yes, Margit is something else. In fact, in the network test, I saw a lot of people, a lot of popular YouTubers, with significant experience with the Souls games get absolutely destroyed at Margit, completely getting messed up. It was amazing. Now, Margit stands as a gatekeeper to Stormveil Castle. You cannot get into the area without killing him, and the in-game plot is pushing you to go into Stormveil Castle. And so Margit, like Tree Sentinel and Agheel, is an educator. Tree Sentinel teaches you that you don't have to immediately fight everything that you see. Agheel teaches you the utility of Torrent for both.
See, that is presupposing that you're not an extremely stubborn individual like myself, who did kill the Tree Sentinel because he was there, and that just pissed me off. How dare he exist in a space and make me think he was Melina because I wasn't paying attention and he was riding a horse on my first playthrough. So he just absolutely curb stomped me. So yeah, I am that type of individual who will retry over and over until I get it. So I did have a very rough experience playing Elden Ring at the very beginning just because of the control scheme kind of pissing me off with like the input delay and the guard counters not being as effective as I imagined they were going to be based off the tutorial, and just in general with the weird setup between the Grafted Scion and then the Tree Sentinel. I was not having a good time my first 6 hours or so playing the game. But then I went to Caelid and I learned to love the bomb.
With dealing and avoiding damage. But Margit teaches you the most important lesson of all, that you need to get good. And in that sense, he's less of a teacher and more like a final exam. He demands that the player have a certain level of mastery over this game already. The first thing he does is reinforce the Tree Sentinel lesson. By being the hardest boss in the surrounding regions, he invites the player to go out and get some adventures under his belt before challenging him. He encourages the player to go out, get the levels and the loot, and most importantly, the experience fighting other bosses that will be useful when you finally face Margit again. And if you do that, the game specifically rewards you for it. In your travels, you might come across Margit's Shackle, an item that when used in Margit's boss fight will bind him to the earth for a bit, making the fight easier. It's an item that makes clear that From Software wants to heavily reinforce this idea, that you have more options when you come up against a wall than simply banging your head up against it. And that
Well, I agree with Crunchy to an extent. I also think it isn't as clear as it could be because the guidance of grace directs you to Margit almost immediately. And you could make the argument that the Tree Sentinel is like the real first clue that if that's a real first boss, you're going to be in for a bad time. It is possible to miss the Tree Sentinel. I do think it's, fairly unlikely, although I'm pretty sure like there have been people who've done it. But either way, let's say you either fought the Tree Sentinel and killed him or you didn't. Maybe you didn't just because you're like, okay, well, the game is obviously like way too hard, so I'm going to move past that. And then the next thing that it does is it gives you a little bit of trash mobs along the way, which should be a good indication to go elsewhere. And then it gives you Margit. That might set the expectation that, hey, idiot, bosses are super hard. Deal with it. So I wouldn't be surprised if people got like a little bit misled by that. So the point that I want to make with all that, which I've talked about so often already on this stream, is that by making Margit Shackle tied to Patches' arena, or not arena, but like area, it only rewards people who actually went that way. But I think if you gave the shackle to Kale and then made its price prohibitively expensive to a certain degree, it might encourage people to be like, oh, wait a second. If I go out and get more runes by exploring the world to get this item that'll help me fight Margit, that might give a bit of a better hint that they can do that, or that they're kind of encouraged to do that. So with that being said, that might not be like the best fix for everything in the game, but they do have other options they could have explored to make it a little clearer. That's what people should do, rather than throwing them in the metaphorical crucible right at the beginning. No, this one's Crunchy, isn't it? Ratatoskr. Oh yeah, no, Crunchy's voice is deeper. That is totally my fault. Thanks for pointing it out, guys. Yeah, no, this is another video by Ratatoskr. I don't know why, they just kind of have like similar vibes to me. Hopefully I'm not alone in thinking that. And my apologies to Ratatoskr and Crunchy.
Clear that From Software wants to heavily reinforce this idea that you have more options when you come up against a wall than simply banging your head up against it. And that when that happens, if you take the opportunity to explore, you will be rewarded for the effort. But there's much more to it than that. Once you get to the fight proper, levels and loot may increase the amount of mistakes you can make in a boss fight, but unless you're extremely over-leveled, that's probably not going to be enough. Margit requires that you have at least a rudimentary understanding of how combat works in this game. He has several large openings that you can take advantage to do fully charged R2s, and if you take those opportunities and continue to put on the pressure on Margit, you could break his stance several times throughout the boss fight. Margit is the first boss that really hammers home how useful these stance-breaking attacks and aggressive play can be. His delayed attacks and several hit combos will also make it clear what the consequences are for panic rolling. Blocking some of his heavier attacks will drain a lot of your stamina, and blocking attacks from his magic weapons will do chip damage through the shield.
I just had another idea about like giving Margit's shackle to like Kale. That also could have been a good hint to go back to the Church of Hale, or whatever it is, after you meet Melina, so that way you could get the spirit summoning bell that would allow you to use the spirit jellyfish. Which, I mean, I think a lot of people naturally gravitated to that exchange there, but I could also see many people going from the Stranded Graveyard, the first step, to Church of Hale, to the like little Stormvale gate, and then into Stormvale, and then not going back for whatever reason, but who knows. Beans and Rice says, there's this old animal intelligence test that's basically a test for lateral thinking. Basically, they put a barrier between an animal and some food, and there's a way around the barrier. The test is, how close does the opening need to be for the animal to notice the way around the barrier? You think most of the first bosses and problem games are like that? Maybe. So it seems like I am just a dumb animal, doesn't it?
Together these teach you both stamina management, and that there are some attacks you shouldn't try and block. I just love Margit so much. He's such a cool boss. Okay, this is what makes him so great. This is his main thing. He teaches you both of the lessons that the Tree Sentinel teaches you at the same time. Like I said in an earlier video, the Tree Sentinel teaches two different lessons to two different types of players, and both of those lessons are correct. The first lesson is that you don't have to engage with everything that you see, that sometimes it's better to explore and come back to a boss later. And Margit does that. He teaches that lesson. It's clear that he was meant to teach that lesson because the Margit Shackle is an item that you can find in the game by exploration. But for the Tree Sentinel, if you choose to forego that lesson and ram your head against the wall, the Tree Sentinel teaches you that if you do that enough times, you will break the wall down. And Margit also teaches that lesson as well. Because even if you go off and explore...
I think that's a pretty fair statement there, but I also do think that they could have given more direction for exploration if they wanted to hint at that, but maybe this whole point of if you try hard enough to break down the wall, you will, is another good point to bring up.
And gain some levels and gain some experience, Margit is still going to be a brick wall that you need to learn to break down. You still need to understand the fundamentals of combat. You still need to understand stamina management. You still need to understand dodging at the right time. You still need to understand that there are some attacks that you can guard and guard counter to, and some you shouldn't try and block. Now obviously there's a limit to how much this applies if you go off and get overleveled. But generally Margit is going to be the guy that teaches the player to either get good or causes them to refund the game and leave a 0 review score on Metacritic.
Hold on. Ubisoft needs to innovate, but when it's a Souls game, then innovation is overrated. It's okay that it has the worst controls of all time. It's okay that it has 2014 graphics. It's okay that... ... Finest hypocrisy I've ever seen. I agree, Far Cry 6 is extremely outdated, but so is Elden Ring. Same animations, worse controls than any Ubisoft game. If FromSoft doesn't innovate and gets 97 on Metacritic, why do you think Ubisoft would even care to innovate at this point? Even if they try, these hypocrites will poop on them and praise this unfinished trash, Elden Ring, as next generation of open world games. Gaming is dying, and believe it or not, it's not thanks to Ubisoft. It's dying thanks to games like Elden Ring and Cyberpunk 2077. Both overhyped, both underdelivered. Man. Give me some fries to go with that salt.
Which in a way is appropriate because he's really the guy that's telling you, this is what the rest of the game is going to be like. If you want to proceed past this point, you have to get good. You can get good in whatever way you want. More options are available now than ever before. But get good you will, or you will not go further. And that is the end of this video. As always, thank you very much for watching. Hello and welcome, this is
very short and sweet. Another good video by Ratatoskr. Let's go ahead and link that one in the chat. Did I link gems in the chat? I think I did. Maybe I didn't. Let me look up. Pretty sure I did. Okay, yeah, I did. So, yeah, okay. Was there anything else that I wanted to say about Margit specifically? No, I think Ratatoskr does bring up some good points that it could be telling you to leave or it could be telling you to break through the wall. But like I've been saying so many times, I do think they could have given players more options to make that a bit clearer. But again, that could also just speak into going along with the style of FromSoft, which I know some people wouldn't necessarily want to see changed. So a little bit of damned if they do, damned if they don't. Maybe after your first couple deaths against Margit, they could have forced that roundtable invite from Melina with another line telling you to consider exploring. Yeah, they could have done something like that. They could have also made a character like Vare to tell you, like, hey, if you go there, you'll die, idiot. You need to, like, prepare yourself to actually think about storming a castle as a one-man army. You know, anything along those lines. And actually, I know in earlier development, they had Hugh somewhere before Stormvale Castle, so it would have been a better hint to upgrade your weapons there. Oh, yeah, you can't even upgrade your weapons. Oh, no, you can, because there's the anvil next to Kale, even. Okay, so yeah, with the anvil, I guess there is enough incentive to go back to the church there. I just kind of forget about it because, I don't typically make like a lot of brand new games. Although I've done it often enough with the 1.0 playthroughs. Either way, yeah, I guess there is a good incentive to go back to that church if you remember that stuff's there. Either get good or get some friends to help. Oh yeah, and that is the other thing that I wanted to bring up. And also welcome back to the stream, Rabs Rabble. So Margit is as hard as you make him out to be, and this is kind of the cool and terrible thing about Elden Ring, in that you can trivialize a hell of a lot of bosses if you use spirit summons, and Margit can be made a hell of a lot easier if you use like either the spirit jellyfish, because it's fairly tanky for its level, but also the undead bandits that you can get from killing the first Tibia Mariner in the northeast section of Limgrave, because they can reanimate, and Margit isn't super aggro against them to the point where he will typically like break their bodies after they die, although he does have sweeping enough attacks where it can happen. So Margit is super unfair if you don't use Spirit Ashes for a new player, but I do think there is enough incentive for new players to have like Spirit Ashes. So I don't know. Margit is simultaneously too damn easy and too damn hard, which is just kind of makes my head spin trying to talk about it. Ravs went around the castle and into Liurnia, and you totally bypassed Margot for a while on your first playthrough. I cannot read or speak. Beans and Rice thinks that From tries to hide some of the alternate paths, such as the detour around Stormvale. There is no obvious detour, but if you brave the path anyway, you can find a paved road eventually. Yeah, I totally went to Liurnia before Stormvale because I had gone to the east section of Limgrave and I met Blythe and he told me about Iji. So I went in search of him because I knew I had all these upgrade stones, but I couldn't use them because I went through a bit of Caelid before that. So I really went around about way through the game at first, and I still killed Margit my first time through. I should like review my footage just to see what my level was, because I used a spirit summon and felt bad about it. Okay, so with these videos done for tonight, we will go into Smoughtown's next video tomorrow. I might only plan to watch this one just because of how long I've been going over looking at these ones so far. So maybe if there's still time tomorrow after this, we'll do like a short video or two after that. So till then, you all stay safe. We will be going live again tomorrow, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as usual, and all that. All right. That'll be it for me. Last Protagonist out.